Genial Prince.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.
Okay, we got the slides.
Clicker left, right.
Excellent. Left and right. Okay. I'll just wait for everybody to make a quick transition. So for the English speakers, there's going to be Bulgarian panels going on in the other room. So for those that want to go and watch the Bulgarian panels now, that's perfectly fine. The less people in here, the less nervous I'll probably be. This is my first ever slideshow presentation. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Plowman and the rest of the team that have put this together. A quick anecdotal story. I just run into Alan Farrington. Who knows who Alan Farrington is in the room? Yeah, well, he's sitting out there shitting himself nervous because he didn't realize this was going to be as professional and as big and as profound that this is. So he's out there, you know, jigging around with his slides, trying to make sure that everything is good. Right, so yeah, usury, your bank, and you. Let's see if I can get this clicker working here. Other way. Okay, so who am I? Daniel Prince. I'm the host of the Once Bitten podcast and the author of Choose Life, which Plowman, I hope the books have arrived. If they have, then I'll be signing some books. So who's heard of the Once Bitten podcast? Okay, thank you. Who's been on the Once Bitten podcast? There's a Bulgarian guy here. He came on about 3.5, 4 years ago, I think. Crypto Addict on Twitter. So if go and find him. He's got a really interesting story about homeschooling, world schooling. That's how we met on the road with our families in Spain on a beach, and we just talked about Bitcoin the whole time. And I invited him to come on the show. So it's nice to know that there's a good, healthy mix of plebs and big names on the Once Bitten podcast. So please go and check that out. So usury, your bank, and you. Why did I start writing? I wrote an article about this, and it was published by Consensus Network. Now the slides are heavy text. One, to help me with my nerves, and two, because I know not everybody here is native English speaker. So there is a lot of text up here to help you along with the presentation. So what is usury? Well, it's the practice of lending money and charging the borrower interest, especially at an exorbitant or illegally high rate. It is derived from the Latin word usura. The practice of usury has been discussed amongst philosophers, economists, and religions for thousands of years. We can go back to Aristotle, who discussed usura in his book, Politic, in the year 350 BC, where he outlined 3 ways to make money. Number 1, knowledge of livestock. Which are the most profitable and where? What sort of horses, sheep, oxen, any other animals are most likely to make a return? A man, back in those days, if he wanted to make money, he ought to know which of these pay better than others and which pay best in particular places. Where do you need the animals? Where do you move them? Where do you house them? What kind of shelter? What kind of protection? This was critical first point on how to make money back in the days of Aristotle. Number 2, service for hire. Basic. Plumber, baker, candlestick maker, shoemaker, arts, other unskilled and bodily labor, hard labor, whatever that you can do to add value to your economy and charge somebody money to make money for yourself, to look after your family, and feed and shelter them. The third, usury, the most hated sort, and with the greatest reason, is usury, which makes a gain out of money itself and not from the natural object of it. Money was intended to be used in exchange, but not to earn interest. And this term interest, which means the birth of money from money, is applied to the breeding of money because the offspring resembles the parent. Therefore, of all the modes of getting wealth, this is the most unnatural. He wasn't holding back, Aristotle, when he was talking about usury and interest. And he was a philosopher. So as we can see throughout the centuries, we can find many more documented thoughts and beliefs about the practice of usury in society, especially in religious texts. So I got looking around, just doing basic Google searches. I wanted to find what religions looked at usury and how they looked at usury. And probably not to your surprise, I found a fair amount. And I'm going the wrong way. Here we go. So Exodus 22:25. If you lend money to any of my people, with you who is poor, you shall not be like a moneylender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. So this would be Christian religion. Again, I believe Christian. You shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. In Islam, riba, and I know Alan's written about this. I think he had an article, Money is Halal. In Islam, riba is explained as an exploitative means of increasing one's wealth. This is because a person with surplus money lends it to someone in desperate need of it. Now we have Muslim religion. O you who have believed, fear Allah and give up what remains due to you of interest. What they're saying is, give up your interest. Do not keep charging interest on anything that you've loaned to anybody. Buddhism also takes a dim view. This is from Siddhartha Gautama. One discerns wrong livelihood as wrong livelihood and right livelihood as right livelihood. And what is wrong livelihood? Scheming, persuading, hinting, belittling, and charging interest. This is wrong livelihood. Anyone getting triggered right now? A little bit? How many people here have a mortgage? How many people have a loan on a car? How many people have a loan on anything that you're being charged interest on? Okay. How do we live in a world where usury is used in society every second of every day, and how was that system captured and shaped? The study of money has become many a Bitcoin pleb's favorite pastime, but there's a book out there that I don't think many people have read. In fact, there are two. I forgot to put one in. The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Make note of it. Many people have read The Creature from Jekyll Island, but The Secrets of the Federal Reserve was written in 1948 by Eustace Mullins, and he does a much more thorough job about how the Federal Reserve System came to be in the United States. So, the book I'm referencing here for the rest of this slideshow is called Red Symphony by Jay Landowski. It's not a book. And this was the thing that gave me goosebumps when I read this. It's a transcript. It's a transcript of a conversation that took place on the 26th of January, 1938, between Gavril Kuzmin and Christian Rakovsky. Who are these guys? Nobody's ever heard of them. Kuzmin was Stalin's top NVKD agent and key interrogator. This interrogation was going on during the show trials. Rakovsky was a Trotskyite. He was pulled in to be interrogated. He'd been the Russian ambassador to France and was to be executed the next day unless he could disclose information to his interrogator that would be of use to Stalin. These torture sessions were horrific. This is actually, the transcript is a chapter in a much bigger book. I've not read the bigger book, I've just read this one. And it is thin and it is encapsulating. You can't stop reading it. Landowski was in charge of keeping Rakovsky talking by pouring just the right amount of red wine as they sat by an open fire. Now, Landowski was kidnapped himself by the NKVD because of his knowledge of biochemistry. So in other torture sessions, he had seen the most horrific things, and he was made to do the most horrific things for fear of his own life. In this setting, luckily for Landowski, all he had to do was keep pouring just the right amount of red wine into Rakovsky's glass to keep him talking. They'd set it up next to an open fire, and Rakovsky and Kuzmin are very highly intelligent. When you read the book, you can just tell it oozes intelligence, their conversation. The conversation took place in French, and Landowski had to transcribe translate the conversation into Russian for Stalin. And he was secretly keeping lots of notes, and he kept a complete copy of this conversation. The way we know this knowledge now is because Landowski ultimately died in a gulag, and a Spanish soldier found his body, and he found this transcript around his body, and he got that, and he kept it, and he got it to a translator, an author in Spain, who then translated it into many different languages. So the conversation starts, and these are the ones I had to pick lines that were most pertinent to this conversation. I only want to decipher the basic axiom. Money is power. Money is today the center of global gravity. This is what Rakovsky was trying to explain to Kuzmin, the interrogator. It is clear that in your imagination, there immediately appeared pictures of real money, of metal and paper, but that is not so. So when Rakovsky was explaining to him, Kuzmin, he couldn't picture exactly what money is, but Rakovsky knew. He knew how the system had been set up. They created credit money. Who are they? Who are they? They created credit money with a view to making its volume close to infinite. Sound familiar? And to give it the speed of sound. It is an abstraction, a being of thought, a figure, number, credit. Banks, the stock exchanges, the whole world financial system is a gigantic machine for the purpose of bringing about unnatural scandals, and according to Aristotle's expression, to force money to produce money. So Rakovsky was looking back at Aristotle. That is something that, if it is a crime in economics, then in relations to finances, it is a crime against the criminal code, since it is usury. There's that word again. So Rakovsky is trying to explain to his interrogator, to save his life, because he knows this information is going to get back to Stalin, he's trying to give him on a plate how the monetary system has been set up. And Stalin doesn't know this. Nobody knows this. This was the biggest secret. And when you read the book, it goes back to the French Revolution, whereby people of France thought that they had stolen the power and the king's heads and whatever else, and now we're in charge. Whereas behind the scenes, there were people who had stolen the real power, the power of money, the power of being able to print money and control money. Bearing in mind that lawful interest is fixed not on real capital, but on non-existing capital, the interest is illegal by so many times as the fictional capital is greater than the real one. What's he talking about? He's talking about the printed money that gets printed into the system and then has interest charged upon it. Sound familiar? Yes. Imagine to yourself, this is still Rakovsky, imagine to yourself, if you can, a small number of people having unlimited power through the possession of real wealth, and you will see that they are the absolute dictators of stock exchange, and as a result of this, also the dictators of production and distribution, and also of work and consumption. If you have the power of the money printer, you have everything at your fingertips. If you have the imagination, then multiply this by the global factor. And it's difficult to multiply that by the global factor. Like I said before, many people are pushed into getting mortgages for their homes, just basic shelter, which should be a consumption good, not a capital good. Many people are pushed into or tricked into to keep up with the Joneses, a new car, a new couch, new television, new washing machine. Keep that in mind. Rakovsky was trying to hammer home the point that it's the monopoly in money creation and the related coercion and deception that is not just criminal and unethical, but also where the rot begins to creep into and shape society. The current financial system works against us to perpetually inflate the amount of money in the system, constantly debasing the purchasing power of our hard-earned money. Hard facts to swallow. And that's why many of us are already down the Bitcoin rabbit hole and opting out of this system and opting for the parallel system, the system of Bitcoin, the complete opposite to this. So now let's walk through an everyday example that many people here can probably connect with. Taking out a mortgage for a home. The first thing to understand is that the current cost of buying a house is exorbitant, which is a direct consequence of the trap set by those that Rakowski has described. Real estate markets around the world are a joke. Inflated prices due to the money printing of the central bank of your choice wherever you live. The house is not going up in value. Your money is losing purchasing power. Whatever currency that is, it's losing purchasing power. Real estate should not be a store of value. It's nonsense. To earn the right to take out a mortgage, you must first make a deposit. This deposit is usually a large sum of money, representing many years of the time and energy you expended to acquire it. In many cases, this could be somebody's life savings at that point. Maybe you're 27, 28, 30 years of age. You've been working 5, 6 years. After your degree, you're paying off your student debt. You've saved enough, just enough, working overtime, side hustles, to get 50,000 euros, pounds, yen, whatever it is, currency of your choice, doesn't matter. It's a large amount. It represents your life savings up until that point. But it can't buy you a home. It can buy you a foot in the bank to say, hey, I've got 50,000 euro. Can I borrow the other 250,000? The bank only has to keep a fraction of every dollar it gets, generally anywhere between 0 and 10%, depending on where you live and the current policy of that central bank. In the US, it's currently 0. 0! This is from the Fed, from their website. Reserve requirements, as announced on March 15, 2020, the board reduced reserve requirement ratios to 0% effective March 26, 2020. This action eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions. But you have to give over your hard-earned money that you've spent time and energy getting to not even buy a house. The next part of this process is still very difficult to come to terms with, but as pointed out by Rune Osgaard in his book Fraud Coin, which I suggest all of you read, it's an excellent book about inflation. Banks do not use depositors' money to issue loans. Banks do not use depositors' money to issue loans. That cannot be stressed enough. How do we know this? Because the Bank of England said the quiet thing out loud. That's how we know this. Money creation in the modern economy. This is a report from the Bank of England. It's written by Michael McClay, Amar Radia, Ryland Thomas of the Bank's Monetary Analysis Directorate. 3 mega brains in the Bank of England about to tell us how the economy actually works. One common misconception is that banks act simply as intermediaries, lending out the deposits that savers place with them. That's a misconception. If you think your bank is loaning you money from other people's deposits, forget it. Take that idea off the table. That's not happening. Indeed, viewing banks simply as intermediaries ignores the fact that in reality, in the modern economy, commercial banks are the creators of deposit money. Commercial banks are the creators of deposit money. This article explains how, rather than banks lending out deposits that are placed with them, the act of lending creates deposits. The act of lending creates deposits. The reverse of the sequence typically described in textbooks. The Bank of England are telling you what you're told for your degree in economics is bullshit. It's unbelievable. Yeah, I forgot. I told you I had gifts. It is one of those moments. They said the quiet part out loud. This results in what is termed the multiplier effect, which means that the initial deposit can result in much larger amounts of money in circulation within the banking system. As more loans are taken out by the individuals, Residential properties rise in price as a result of the increased money supply, as we were talking about earlier. It's this flooding of the money in. When you are going in with your hard-earned money, you are green-lighting the bank to inflate the monetary supply. Apply this on a grand scale, as Rutkowski begged Kuzmin to imagine. Global scale. Realize that this is happening every minute of every day, not just with property, but for many other reasons that individuals may apply for bank loans. Would this behavior drive price inflation? We think so. Thank you, Christine. Mainstream economic teaching still pushes the basic belief that inflation occurs when the aggregate quantity of goods demanded at any particular price level rises more quickly than the aggregate quantity of goods supplied at that price level. That's classic textbook economics theory, Keynesian theory right there. Yeah, I did find some good gifts. Now, with our newfound knowledge of how the banks deposit the loan into your bank account, let's get back to the example of mortgage and usury. Your deposit has been made. The bank loans you the rest of the money by creating a deposit in your bank for the transaction of the house purchase. This loan is what they will charge you interest on. This is usury in the purest form. Let's revisit what Rutkowski repealed, bearing in mind that lawful interest is fixed not on real capital but on non-existing capital. The interest is illegal by so many times as the fictional capital is greater than the real one. They are charging us interest on money that never existed. It doesn't matter if you've entered into a deal at 0.5%, 1%, 1.5%, 4%. If you think you're signing off on a good deal, you're not. That money never existed. They're charging you interest on it. It's usurious and it's criminal. The bank counterfeits money, charges you interest. Now, at this point, you might be getting pretty angry. How have we been tricked into participating in this scheme? Somebody went up against this. It's known as the Credit River case. Happened in 1968. Defendant was Jerome Daley. The bank was trying to take his property back because he'd fallen behind payments. Daley was a trained lawyer. He represented himself and based his defense on the argument that the bank had not actually loaned him any money, but had simply created credit on its books. This was 1968. He argued that the bank had not given him anything of value and accordingly was not entitled to the property that secured the loan. The jury and the justice of the peace, Martin Mahoney, agreed with his argument. They returned a verdict for the defendant, and the justice of the peace found that the mortgage null and void. The decision meant that Daley did not have to pay the mortgage, debt, nor relinquish the property to the bank. There is him celebrating in the courtroom. He wrote in the local news article, "This decision, which is legally sound, has the effect of declaring all private mortgages on real and personal property and all US and state bonds held by the Fed, national and state banks to be null and void. This amounts to the emancipation of this nation from personal, national, and state debt purportedly owed to this banking system. Every American owes it to himself to study this decision very carefully, for upon it hangs the question of freedom or slavery." Freedom or slavery. The bank appealed. Decision was nullified on the grounds that as justice of peace, Martin Mahoney lacked the authority to enter into such a ruling. Technicality. The district court agreed, meaning that Daley had to pay the mortgage or relinquish the property. They're fucking laughing at us every single second of every day. It's a mockery. Daley was disbarred and banned from ever practicing law again. And adding to the mystery, Justice of the Peace Mahoney was found dead on 22nd of August 1969. The circumstances surrounding his death remain unresolved. Apparently, he went on a fishing trip alone, got drunk, and fell overboard. This is all in this book, if you want to check that case. Behind the Curtain by John Hamer. The whole story is there for anybody to see. So what can you do to protect yourself against usury in the financial system? What's the solution? You opt out. Walk away. Why would you sit there being perpetually beaten by the rulers who change the rules to benefit themselves? The old guys laughing in suits. Under this regime, which is the same in almost all countries, we stand no chance of true prosperity or ethical distribution of wealth. Entrepreneurs, savers, consumers are left without any apparent signal, no real idea of value, no guiding star. We have yet to learn what a truly civilized world could look like, because the monetary system is civilization's foundation and the legal system is just a layer on top of that. So if the foundation is broken, everything else above it is broken. To ensure prosperity, we must design a completely different form of money that stores value rather than loses value over time. A monetary system beyond the control of any centralized power. Any ideas? A means of exchange that runs on an open, easily verified economic system. We need money that is global, available to anyone of any age, from any race or religion, without permission. A store of value that becomes increasingly scarce and desirable over time. An instrument that is difficult to confiscate or steal. Embedded in this new system is a money that could be sent digitally in a matter of seconds to cater for the needs of people living in a modern, interconnected, and highly interdependent civilization. Thankfully, this money has been available to us since the 3rd of January 2009. It works, protecting millions of people and their families around the world. The money is Bitcoin. Bitcoin fixes this. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the next speaker, Ben Duval.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about something you've probably heard quite often, the myth of intrinsic value. So who here has actually heard Bitcoin has no intrinsic value? Yeah? You know what? Lots of people keep saying this. Peter Schiff on Twitter, he says it a lot. It's written a lot. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. Bitcoin seems to be relying on the greater fool theory. All you need to do is profit from an investment to find someone willing to buy the asset at an even higher price. Peter Schiff again. The reason you claim Bitcoin as property is that it's useless as a currency. It has no intrinsic value. Opinion piece. Gotta love opinion pieces. Lacking any intrinsic value. Bitcoin's price could be anything or nothing at all. Yeah. Bitcoin News, quoting somebody there, Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. Bitcoin is highly volatile and has no intrinsic value. Peter Schiff again. Bitcoin is neither a safe haven, a store of value, nor an inflation hedge. That's just the bullshit used to promote Bitcoin. It's merely a highly speculative digital token with no intrinsic value. Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. You know what? I agree. But maybe it's because we don't understand what those words mean. What is intrinsic value? There's actually 3 definitions for intrinsic value, and that's kind of a problem because you're talking to people and you use the term, maybe. Personally, I hate the term. I don't use it, and I'm going to explain why. But there are 3 different definitions. So maybe you're thinking one and another person is thinking another. The first definition of intrinsic value that you come across is the investment style definition. And this is something you'll find on websites like Investopedia. A measure of what an asset is worth that is arrived at by means of an objective calculation or complex financial model, or the what is intrinsic value description there. It's a measure of what an asset is worth. The measure is arrived at by objective calculation or complex financial model. Intrinsic value is different from the current market price of an asset. However, comparing it to the current price can give investors an idea of whether the asset is undervalued or overvalued. Financial analysis uses cash flow to determine the intrinsic or underlying value of a company or a stock. In options pricing, it's the difference between the strike price of the option and the current market price of the underlying asset. Okay, what is all of that? Bitcoin isn't a stock. You can't value it in the same kind of way. It doesn't have underlying cash flow, and all models are wrong. We know that. All models are wrong. Some models are useful, but in this case, no, it's not useful. You've got a model, complex model they described for having intrinsic value. How can something be intrinsic value if it's just this model that you came up with and you did a bunch of calculations and you said, this is the intrinsic value of that thing? It's meaningless. So honestly, that's a bullshit definition of intrinsic value. Nobody should use that. What other definitions? Well, here's a really common one. And this is something you'll find people arguing a lot on Twitter. They'll say that the intrinsic value of a thing is the value that thing would have separate to its use as money. For example, gold's intrinsic value comes from its use in jewelry and electronics. You can use gold in electronics. So clearly it has some kind of intrinsic value separate to its value as money. But money is just a use case of a thing. You know, if I've got gold, I can use it in electronics. I can use it as a store of value. I can use it as a medium of exchange. And maybe it's good at some of these things, maybe it's bad at some of these things. Doesn't matter. Money is just another use case of a thing. So why would we say that something has a definition of intrinsic value being a use case other than money? You know, why have this weird exception there? It'd be like saying, you know, the whatever we call it, value of gold is its use case outside of its use case in electronics. It's a bullshit definition. And besides, there is actually uses of Bitcoin outside of money. You know, Bitcoin can be used as a timestamping system. Open timestamps is a system whereby you can write something into the chain and then prove that it happened at a particular time. You know, is that a great use case? I don't know. It's a use case, and it's not money. So Bitcoin does have uses outside of money. So really, this is another bullshit definition. Let's take a step back and instead look at the words. What does intrinsic mean? Intrinsic is belonging to a thing by its very nature. So you can say, for example, you know, it's intrinsic that humans need to breathe if they want to not die. You know, it's an intrinsic property of humans that we are breathing things. I think that's fairly non-controversial. You know, so intrinsic is something which is inherent to the thing itself. And what's value? Well, value has a bunch of different definitions. There's actually way more. If you Google, you know, definition of value, you'll find huge amounts of different things. So the definition of value really comes down to a question of the subjective desire for a thing. So it can be something like the amount of money or goods and services that's considered to be a fair equivalent for something else. It can be an ideal accepted by some individual or group. Highly regard, think much of, hold dear, synonyms for value as a verb. So what does it mean to value something? Really, it means you want to have it. What is the value of something? It's the intersubjective belief between two people, how much they personally value that thing. So an exchange of some money for a thing is pretty much because I value that thing, you value that money, so I give you the money, you give me the thing, and we're happy. That's value. So in this, if something is intrinsic to a thing, it's inherently an objective fact about that thing. But if we value something, it's inherently a subjective assessment of a thing. So the description of intrinsic value from the words, it's an oxymoron. It's bullshit. There are no sensible definitions of intrinsic value. Every single definition you will find has problems with it. They are all bullshit definitions because intrinsic value doesn't make sense. So if intrinsic value doesn't make sense, what should we be talking about? If all the definitions are bullshit, what now? Intrinsic properties of a thing can define an extrinsic value for that thing. For example, gold. Why does somebody value gold? Because they can use it in electronics, or because it makes nice jewelry, or because it's relatively scarce and you can hold on to it for a long time and then trade it with somebody else because you're expecting that they will want it as well. In other words, a store of value. So things have properties that we can value. So instead of talking about intrinsic value, instead we can talk about intrinsic properties of things. What properties does gold have that people value? It's verifiable, it's relatively scarce, it's malleable, you can shape it into nice stuff, it's fungible. A bar of gold is pretty much the same as another bar of gold. You really can't tell the difference between them unless they've got a stamp on them or something, but in general, an atom of gold is the same as any other atom of gold. And it's conductive, so you can use it in electronics. Gold has these properties, and it makes gold a fairly valuable thing. What properties does Bitcoin have that people value? Bitcoin is verifiable. You can verify Bitcoin on-chain very safely, very securely, very assuredly. Bitcoin is scarce. There's an exact amount, and we know the formula for how much there is going to be at any given time tradable in the world. Bitcoin is extremely portable. something that gold really isn't. I can walk across national borders or fly across national borders with some seed words in my head, which is access to Bitcoin. I can transfer huge amounts on seed words stored on a hardware device. You can take Bitcoin from one place to another really easily. So Bitcoin is very portable. Bitcoin is fungible, meaning one sat is the same as any other sat. There are certain people who are into things like ordinals who are going to disagree with that. That is just another layer on top. That's building something to pretend that Bitcoin isn't fungible, but it absolutely is. You can pretend that one atom of gold is different to another by looking at the history of that atom of gold, but if you don't know its history, it's the same atom of gold. Same thing with Bitcoin. One sat is the same as any other sat. And in fact, just to go into a little bit of the technical stuff, most people think that if I send you some Bitcoin, what I've actually done is sent some Bitcoin that I had. That's actually not true. Every time you make a Bitcoin transaction, you actually destroy all of the Bitcoin that existed in that you had, and you create new Bitcoin, which is exactly the same, new fungible Bitcoin, because you destroy an old UTXO, an unspent transaction output, and you create new UTXOs. So really, Bitcoin isn't transferred between people. Simply the ability to access Bitcoin is transferred, and the new UTXOs are new things. Bitcoin is programmable, something that gold most definitely isn't. I have 2 children. They are aged 13 and 10. And when my 10-year-old was born, so 10 years ago, I created a Bitcoin transaction output with a time lock on it, so that when my kids turn 16, they get access to their long-term cold storage. I can't even access it before then. It has a time lock. So I gave my kids Bitcoin in the future. Nobody can access it, nobody can steal it, nobody can take it. You couldn't force it out of me because I can't access it. So, programmable money. Bitcoin has these properties. Quite often you'll see something that looks like this. This one I took from Vijay Boyapati. It's a fairly common chart. You'll see lots of variants of this. But this is the different common properties that Bitcoin has as money. So monetary properties compared to other kinds of properties. Like I said, gold is malleable, so you can make nice jewelry. Gold is conductive, so you can make electronics out of it. Those are properties, but they're not really monetary properties. So comparing the monetary properties of different kinds of money, Bitcoin versus gold versus fiat, Bitcoin essentially wins in every regard, except, of course, established history. Bitcoin is younger than most other currencies, but that's just a matter of time. There's no technical reason to say that that would be an issue. So that makes Bitcoin better, objectively, at being money than any other form. If you can show me a better form of money, I will stop using Bitcoin and I will use that instead. But I don't believe you can. So how much we care about these properties defines how valuable it is. If I were dying of thirst in a desert, I would love to have a bottle of water. In fact, even standing up here, it's relatively warm, I'm talking a lot. I probably value a bottle of water right now slightly more than somebody who's just sitting there not talking, because, I'm getting a little bit thirsty. Thank you very much. Excellent. So, how much we care about these properties define how valuable they are. This bottle of water is more valuable to me than it was to Rachel sitting down there. Thank you very much. But that also means that the properties of the water are the things that I care about. It quenches my thirst. It makes me less thirsty. And I care about that more than I would have cared about the amount of money I might have spent buying a bottle of water after this talk. Now I don't need to, thank you. Jump back a slide to those properties. How much do I care about my money being durable? How much do I care about my money being portable, fungible, verifiable, divisible, scarce, having an established history, and being censorship resistant? I will place different values on those things than somebody else might. In fact, some people may say, I will not use money which doesn't have a ridiculously long established history. Personally, I say I do not care about the established history of a money. I care about the other properties much more. I care that it's scarce, because scarce money can't be unnecessarily inflated. Of course, you can have things built around it. You can have paper Bitcoin, so Bitcoin stored on exchanges, and the exchange pretends to have Bitcoin that they actually don't. So there are properties that, but that's not a property of Bitcoin, that's a property of this imaginary thing built around it. How divisible is my money? I care a lot about that. How verifiable? I care very much about that. So the properties that I care about are the ones that Bitcoin beats other types of money in. Therefore, I'm a Bitcoiner. If you care about these properties as well, you should be a Bitcoiner. That's, I think, most of the people in this room probably are. So how much we care about the properties define how valuable a particular thing is. So yeah, Bitcoin has no intrinsic value. That's a fact. But Bitcoin has intrinsic properties that make it extremely valuable in the world that we live in. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. I wonder if we're running a little ahead of time. So I see Alan is he's getting mic'd up right now. So we'll just give him. Yes, please, Rachel. Please ask a question. Wait a second. What made you pick 16 for your time lock for your child for the recording?
Actually, nothing in particular other than the fact that in the culture that I grew up in, 16 is generally considered an adult. So I simply aimed for 16.
No.
My mother left home
There's
when
no
she was
way
16. I left home when I was 16.
achieving
So
that.
as soon as my kids are 16, out they go. No, I'm kidding. But no, chances are when that time lock expires, I'm not just going to give it straight to my kids. I'm going to continue to custody it myself. But I have the keys. But at that point, I have the ability to give it to my kids. Yeah.
Were there any other questions,
Yeah.
before? Yes, Rado. Yep.
Correct. Yes, the US dollar does not have intrinsic value either. I would argue nothing has intrinsic value. So sure, Bitcoin doesn't have intrinsic value, but nothing has intrinsic value because the definition of intrinsic value is ridiculous. Like I said, out of those three definitions, one of them was really a financial thing based on weird calculations. Another was some random thing that people came up with on the internet about its monetary use case being separate to other use cases. Why? It makes no sense. And the third version, it's an oxymoron. You've got a objective and a subjective thing coming together. It's ridiculous to say that anything has intrinsic value. They have intrinsic properties that we value.
One more question, yes? Is it difficult to put a time lock on your Bitcoin?
Yeah, is it technically difficult? Back when I did it, yes, you kind of had to do it manually, but I believe there's plenty of tools out there for doing it now. Things have progressed a lot in the last 10 or so years.
All right, Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. So, Alan Farrington is next up. I met Alan actually on Safer Dean's course back in 2019, 2020. And I've always loved Alan's writing, and I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So please put your hands together for Alan Farrington.
That's a pie, by the way. The title of this talk means absolutely nothing. There's no such thing as web pie. Because there's no such thing as Web3 either. It's bullshit. It's a scam. Unfortunately, it's turned out to have been extremely powerful bullshit and an extremely profitable scam. And so the goal of this talk is basically to, I guess, in some sense, convince you that's the case if you weren't convinced already, but try to prime you for what I think is coming with scams and bullshit of this variety. So in the spirit of not scamming and not bullshitting, I want to be quite clear about who you are, who I am, who this talk or what this talk is really about. So I assume that you are not a shadowy super coder. I mean, you might be. Probably won't learn as much in that case. I assume that you're maybe just coming to Bitcoin for the first time. If you think that you are coming to crypto for the first time, then I think this will actually be even more useful in that case. Who am I? So I am a prolific shit poster. You probably know me more by that logo or that image, I guess, than my actual face. When I'm not shit posting, I do have a real job. I run a company that invests in the Bitcoin space. That's our logo. That's the QR code to our website. I gave the first version of this talk that I gave was actually in a private setting to a bunch of TradFi people. So I've amended it to be more appropriate here, but I'm not going to shill you a venture fund. So this is maybe not super relevant. But there will be some QR codes that I do put up like this throughout the talk. I think the rest of them may be more interesting if you want to save those web pages mostly for later. And who is this about? So it's not about people who work in crypto. And I think more seasoned Bitcoiners in the crowd might be, I don't know, mildly irritated or at least surprised when I go on to give probably about as charitable a description of those people as you'll likely to have heard from somebody like me. It is specifically about financiers, so all of this nonsense. It's about people who, in my view at least, use the mostly unrewarded efforts, I think, of, whether it's academics, developers, entrepreneurs even, basically to siphon money from you, who I'm assuming are, potential retail investors, to themselves. So why this talk? Well, I think we're at a very interesting point in the history of if you want to call it, I guess, the crypto industry at large, such that you are about to see, I very strongly predict you are about to see a lot of what I'm going to go on to describe, but in a new flavor that will potentially seem appealing, but I want to give you the tools to recognize it and dismiss it. So what we're going to go through in this talk is why Bitcoin, not crypto. I'll give a very short explanation of this and then a slightly lengthier one. Accounts of historical scams and bullshit. Again, two approaches to explaining this. So one more historical and then one kind of theoretical that sets us up for the conclusion, which is just how to avoid them. So what is a blockchain for? This is I think asking this question is a very simple way to address why Bitcoin, not crypto. So I would argue a blockchain is for sound, censorship-resistant, peer-to-peer digital money. It is not for decentralizing all the things. It is not for arbitrary computation and storage. It's not for illegal securities rackets. It's for money, plain and simple. So how does it achieve that? I think the answer here is even simpler. It achieves it by proof of work and the difficulty adjustment. These are the innovations from which everything else flows. So proof of work enables censorship resistance. If somebody is trying to sell you on proof of stake, it's bullshit. The difficulty adjustment enables predetermined, fair, costly, maybe even most importantly, issuance. If someone is trying to sell you on a token that they have issued themselves for free, that's a scam. If this sounds extreme to you, then I'm sorry to say that I think you either have been or are at serious risk of being extremely scammed or extremely bullshit. And I think you potentially need this talk. And I should say as well, so that's a short version, right? I'm sensitive to this maybe sounding a little bit extreme. You may or may not be aware that there's been billions, I mean probably at this point hundreds of billions of dollars poured into X, Bitcoin, crypto. Huge amount of it is actually widely used, as I'll get onto, probably more charitably than some of you would like. And there's plenty of perfectly capable, honest people who work in the industry. But I think I'm particularly well placed to comment on this, just given what my my day job is when I'm not shitposting, which is basically follows from the observation that there's a huge amount of Bitcoin founders that I see who spent a huge amount of time in crypto, basically only to realize that whatever they were doing um, didn't make any technical or economic sense. And I think that's a framing that I'm going to get onto. And so eventually, I find them in the first place because they've ended up coming to Bitcoin. Right. So this is now getting into the longer version. So this is my account of the scams and the bullshit. I think this is the most helpful way of breaking down the current state of X Bitcoin crypto. So stablecoins, cryptography, R&D, gambling, and scams. And I think it's quite important to realize that these are not exclusive at all. There's significant overlap here, and if anything, I think the overlap is probably the key. So scams are tokens, plain and simple, right? If somebody is trying to sell you on a token that they have issued for free, they are scamming somebody. It might be you, the retail investor. It might be the venture investor. It might be further up the chain of capital allocation. It could be further removed from that, even if it even if it makes sense to say that there's suppliers or customers. Somebody somewhere is being scammed. I think the sad thing, though, or it's kind of interesting, it depends on your perspective. I guess it depends whether you have been scammed yourself, is that it's almost never just a scam. There's almost always components of either stablecoins, R&D, or gambling. And so these are the ones that I want to pay more attention to. This is my very high level summary of how I think we should think about each of these categories. And I'll explain what I mean by this in a lot more detail in a second. So I would argue that stablecoins have economic merit, but they have no technical merit. R&D has technical merit, but no economic merit. Gambling kind of has merit. It depends how you interpret it. And then obviously scams just have neither, right? So this is what I mean by this. And this is obviously quite simplified. It's, again, this framing of economic and technical merit, I'm going to come back to again and again. So by no technical merit, what I mean is that stablecoins have central issuers. So you can issue a stablecoin as a token on a blockchain, but there's not really much of a good technical reason to do this. You could just as easily have a database that is connected to the public internet. You can have relatively simple, cryptographic schemes for signing the transfers and whatever, and it would be basically the same thing. It would actually be cheaper and faster as well. And I think probably in particular the fact that Tron is by far the most heavily used for this, at least as distinguished from various other so-called use cases within crypto, that's testament to exactly this point, because Tron is barely pretending not to even be a database, but it pretty much just is. And I think all of this works, or at least hasn't been shut down basically, because regulators think that this is innovation, right? It's kind of a form of regulatory arbitrage, but they're mistaken. It's really just quite silly. And I think another way of conceiving even of no technical merit is just by comparison to Bitcoin. So obviously, I would hope this is obvious at least to this audience. Bitcoin can't just be shut down by the action of a regulator. Bitcoin just doesn't care, right? Whereas for stablecoin issuers, if you can just shut them down in 10 minutes or whatever, it's clearly not sound. It's clearly not censorship resistant. It's not really what a blockchain is for. On the other hand, though, they are extremely widely used and valued, basically as a form of kind of dollar shadow banking in a way. And crypto people love pointing to this, and I think Bitcoiners tie themselves in knots trying to explain this away in a lot of cases. In my view, though, I'm really just not sure that there's much of a connection at all. I mean, there's obviously a superficial connection. Hence, I wouldn't be mentioning it otherwise. But I think you can create any kind of superficial connection you want by tokenizing things for no particularly good technical reason. I think the better way to think about stablecoins is that it's a subsection or a sub industry even of payments. And for the time being, or for its history to date, let's say, it's been allowed to operate um, because regulators have been successfully bamboozled by all the things that I'm trying to shed light on just now. So no technical merit, but potentially economic merit. Uh, Cryptography R&D is maybe even easier to understand. So it's it's maybe worth giving a bit of context though, that it's only really in I guess crypto at large, kind of Ethereum when you look at it more closely though, that you can have arbitrarily complex cryptographic schemes that operate on real and potentially enormous value. And so there are some people, it's understandable that that they would find this attractive, given that whatever they're doing is essentially academic, and the alternative is probably submitting a paper to a journal, say, or just putting something on archive. And this is arguably, I mean, it's certainly more fun, it's arguably more interesting, more worthwhile at all. So technical merit in that sense, but then obviously the value that is being manipulated is just nonsense. It ultimately relies on either gambling or scams, and so I would claim no economic merit. um, Last one on this slide, gambling is a really interesting lens to adopt on all of this, because it's a $1 trillion industry pretty much, and it's real as well, right? It's not like it's not fake, it's not criminal, it's consensual, it's legitimate economic activity, and it generates enormous profits for the people who do it well. You could maybe argue that it's unethical, I guess, but I'm not sure I would even argue that. But if you did, it it would have to be a separate column, right? It's not really relevant to this analysis. What potentially is relevant, though, how you would tie it in, is that you could well argue this is a form of deeply unethical gambling, in the sense that the gamblers don't realize that they're playing a negative sum game against the house. I mean, they may not even realize they're gambling at all. They might think that what they're doing is more akin to speculating on securities. Now, speculating on securities obviously can also be pretty stupid. It can be a form of gambling, I guess, but it at least has economic merit in the sense that it's still supporting price discovery, it's still supporting capital accumulation. The difference here is that what is being speculated on has no economic merit. So, if that's your gauge of merit, then obviously there is none, basically. So now I want to get onto a historical account of all of this. That's kind of the current state as I see it. This is how it's all come about. So 2015, Ethereum launches. The narrative here is, now we have uncensorable, decentralized computation. Uh, Towards the end of 2015, we have the ERC20 standard for fungible tokens on Ethereum is proposed. It's adopted, which is why 2016-17 we get the ICO bubble. Notice, though, that the narrative has now changed. So now the narrative is Web 2 companies are big and powerful, and they're gatekeepers and all sorts of other horrible things. What if instead we collectively owned our own data and participated in the upside that our usage is creating? Then 2018, 19, nothing happened. Don't worry about it. 2020, 21, now again, we have a new narrative. So people have more or less collectively realized and accepted that utility tokens don't make any sense. So you can't, create artificial scarcity in something that ought not to have it, arguably ought to deflate rather than appreciate, and expect anybody to care about this, never mind even value it. On the other hand, securities ought to be scarce. You could say maybe you're pushing it a little bit, but they ought to be tradable ledger entries, sort of. So maybe it's not the worst idea in the world to try to tokenize those. So that's why we get DeFi summer, this blossoming of decentralized finance. Which, by the way, QR code time. Me and my co-founder at Axiom predicted in 2021 was going to be a complete and utter disaster. So this is the title page of a paper we wrote at the time, Only the Strong Survive. It's QR code to where this is hosted on our site. And we were absolutely right, because in 2022, all of this collapsed, right? Terra Luna kicked it off, and then you get Voyager, BlockFi, Celsius, whatever else. I forget the rest of them. If Only the Strong Survive was like a pre-mortem of this, we then wrote this this post-mortem after FTX finally collapsed, Green Eggs and Ham. And so now all of this stuff is moving to Bitcoin, or apparently is moving to Bitcoin. I'll get on in a minute or two just to whether that really makes any sense or not. I wanna think about this from, again, going back to this framing of technical and economic merit, or alleged merit. You ignore for now whether there really is any merit. So we start off with, this new method of computing, right? And so what's the addressable market there, right? Is probably some percentage of global GDP, if it meant anything, which it doesn't. But then for the ICO bubble, it's becoming more specific now. So now we're merely disrupting how we organize companies. And so what's that potentially worth? Well, maybe just some percentage of whatever companies are vulnerable to this coming wave of decentralization, which can be turned into dApps. Nothing happened then, don't worry about it. So DeFi, again, it's more specific. Now it's just financial contracts that we're moving into this paradigm. So now it's probably, some percentage of capital markets activity, I guess. Nothing happened then, don't worry about it. And apparently now it's on Bitcoin as well. So there's a couple of things to point out here, I guess, that are interesting about this. I think the most amusing thing is that this starts off, in terms of how it moves through time, right? It starts off just completely insane, right? This means absolutely nothing. What's at the top? As it progresses, it becomes more restrained each time. You can maybe cheekily argue that it starts to make a little bit more sense, at least, but as it gets closer and closer to Bitcoin. So it's clearly, in my view, just converging on Bitcoin, right? And I think this is people realizing over decades at this point what a blockchain is for, right? It is not for decentralizing everything. It's for sound, censorship-resistant, peer-to-peer digital money. And I think this also explains or helps us understand at least the current state of crypto, as I mentioned before. So as all of this converges on Bitcoin, you start to have realizations like the following. So digital gift vouchers for artificially scarce and extremely expensive computation are clearly not money. So if you want this thing to have economic merit, you need some real money in there, and I think that's why you get stable coins. Equally, we now have this this novel computing paradigm, very technically new, at least, it is interesting in its own right to some extent, but the severe handicap of being unable to do, I don't know, a billionth of a billionth of a billionth, or however many times you want to say that, of all of the computations in the world. And so you get cryptography R&D to try to fill that gap. And I think these are very well understood as like short-term patches that, maybe have some merit in isolation, maybe not. But again, I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. But in the meantime, everything is just going right past them and converging on Bitcoin anyway. So going back to this chart, there's 3 points I want to make about this, and then this gets us very nicely to the end of the talk. So the first one is that it's pretty obvious from this that the bubbles follow the price of Bitcoin, right? Hopefully I shouldn't need to put up a price chart for you to just be able to see this, kind of realize it's pretty obviously true straight away. The second point is that you notice that the narrative always changes, right? I kind of alluded to this, but I didn't want to hammer it home until now. Absolutely ridiculous amounts of money was raised for this crap following the Bitcoin bull runs of 2017 and then 2021. A huge amount of that value was presumably destroyed, right? There's nothing useful. It has come out of what it was nominally put into, and so the people doing it need a new narrative, right? The third point, though, is that completely regardless of what the new narrative they come up with is, a consequence of it is always buy my token. Always. It doesn't matter, what else they say, whatever buzzword salad is in the middle of this. It's always Bitcoin is cool, XYZ, whatever, Fugazi, buy my token. And so this is also, just very quickly, this is why I'm somewhat tempted, I guess, to not be too mad, at least, at the likes of, whether it's developers or academics, because I think if you appreciate this dynamic, you figure out who is really to blame from all of this, I guess. And this is the I guess the crescendo of the entire presentation, which I'm pretty sure the next slide is word for word. Yeah, I wanted to put this up so that I didn't have to memorize this. But I think when you understand all of this, you realize that this dynamic is really what drives all of it. It drives everything that you end up seeing that I'm warning you to stay away from. But and I'll read this because I think this is important. The entire cycle of shitcoinery can be traced to unscrupulous financiers convincing capital allocators who don't know any better in a Bitcoin bull run that yes, Bitcoin is cool, but that what they are doing is related to Bitcoin. That's important. Cooler, that's also important, and that they deserve a fee. Now, remember, originally this is me begging TradFi people to not give money to them. That's where I came up with this, to try to nudge them in that direction. But explaining it to you guys is maybe even more important, because you are potentially the closing the loop on all of this. You're the exit liquidity that they need to tie it all together. So on to avoiding them. This is super simple in your case. So when I gave this talk to the TradFi guys, I had to be a lot more nuanced about how I expected them to be pitched this bullshit. In your case, extremely straightforward. I think maybe jumped a slide or put them in the wrong order. Oh no, sorry. The answer is just buy Bitcoin. I think that's the next slide. Yeah. So just buy Bitcoin. But I did want you to appreciate why this is happening now, at least. So as mentioned before, ridiculous amounts of money have been raised and have been put into this. At the same time, we're starting a Bitcoin bull run. It seems is likely the case. And so I strongly predict that not only will all of this shitcoinery return, but more importantly, if you remember the narrative evolution, it's very likely that it's going to be presented as having something to do with Bitcoin this time around. And that, I think, is why it's happening now. The solution for you guys, though, is just buy Bitcoin, right? Just completely ignore these narratives to the best that you possibly can. Do not be bamboozled by technical sounding nonsense like Web3, or probably nobody will actually say WebPi, but you never know what they'll come up with. Be mindful, be aware, the bullshit is coming, but if you guys can be zen, ignore it, stay humble, stack sats, you should be fine. So good luck with that, and thank you very much.
We might have time for questions.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I think we have time for questions. If anybody wanted to, is my mic on? Can you hear me? Yep. If anybody had any questions for Alan, we can just throw them at him before we jump to lunch. Yes. So can all altcoins be categorized as shitcoins?
I think so. Yeah. I can maybe give a slightly more interesting answer. So hopefully this this kind of captures the moral of the talk than any of the details. That with all of this stuff, you can take more of like an academic view, like an intellectual view, and go into the weeds of it. And to some extent, I have to do this for my job. It's like why I know a lot of the things that I ended up explaining. But I think the easier approach is, yeah, just ignore it completely. I think that's a very valuable heuristic if you want to. One kind of amusing way, even of summarizing that entire talk, is that you can just skip the first 90% of it and just buy Bitcoin, and then that's the end of it. This is I wanted to present that more so that people who are in the camp that might be tempted in the first place sort of understand why this is all happening. But if you don't feel the need to understand it, then that's great. That's, you just save yourself time.
Any other questions for Alan? Yes. How would you raise money if you needed to build a business
Do you
in
mean
Bitcoin?
Do you mean one that has something to do with Bitcoin, or just anything?
How to ethically raise money to build like a Bitcoin business?
Yeah. I don't think I have any particular insight there. I don't really think there's a bad way of raising money if the people providing it are fully informed and consent and so on. As long as you're not defrauding your own investor, I don't think it really matters if they understand, the contract they've entered into. I think the problem is that, at least the problem with what I was describing, is that the implied means of exiting the investment cannot help but be fraudulent. And so it almost doesn't matter how this stuff raises. I mean, it's been pretty straightforward, and historically the bigger projects, what they've done, right? They've just taken money on the promise of issuing um, issuing tokens that they intend to later float on exchanges and dump on retail, issuing them to the investors either for free or at a much lower price than they intend to list them. I think that's the component that's unethical. Raising money is fine. I mean, that's kind of, I'm an investor, so if I thought raising money is unethical, it'd be there'd be an odd conflict there. Oh, do you want to repeat that?
But are there potentially good tokens coming down the?
So that links to my previous answer quite nicely, I think. If you want to be super academic about it, yes, potentially. If you want to just save time, no.
So I got a question.
Yeah.
You obviously went around to all of these traditional finance guys that are investing,
Yeah.
they're being pitched by crypto
Yeah.
bros, right? To come invest in our Web3. When you go into that room, into the boardroom, and you show them this, and you try and warn them of what's going to be coming, the kind of people that are going to be coming into their boardroom, the kind of language that they're going to be using, what do they give you feedback on? Like, oh, thank you, you've saved us, or like, or we got scammed on this? Like, are they understanding where you're coming from?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't given this talk or had that kind of conversation, I think, enough times to have a good representative sample, but um, I have spoken to people who have had similar reactions to that, even without hearing it from me necessarily. And I think, yeah, there's a growing cohort of people in TradFi and the various capital allocation rules who are extremely pissed off about all of this, because whether it's 2017 or 2021, they bought it and they've seen, even if they don't necessarily understand it, to the extent that I tried to set up here, they just see the returns. They're like, oh, why are we down 98%? I thought you said this is the future, something like that.
Right. Don't buy shit coins, kids. I think
Yeah.
we got a question here. He identifies as layer 2.
Yeah.
Alan, what is your thoughts on layer 2?
Okay, so
On
I
the
don't know
layer-
if this is even what you mean by the question, but I'll give two answers. So the answer to what I think you mean is I'm bullish. I guess almost everything that we invest in as a venture firm, touches some layer 2 in some or other way. The more amusing answer, though, that ties in with the presentation is that I didn't want to go this much into detail on it because obviously I had limited time to talk about it. But if it were like an hour long, or if it were an essay or something rather than this, I would have further spelled out that the bullshit way the new scams are going to be marketed is mostly as layer 2s. So that's, I don't know if you intended that or not, but that is a good way to further prime you to how to be wary of this stuff, that more specifically than just like, oh, built on Bitcoin. they're going to be, oh, this is a Bitcoin layer 2. Here's our token that, you know, powers it or governs it or gives you some cash flows from it or whatever. But yeah, that don't shitcoin, kids, is bad for you.
There was a question here.
Mhm. 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 Do you want to repeat?
Yeah. So, to sum up your question, is there anything coming on Web3 that, with a decentralized nature, would add value to something else rather
Sure.
than?
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think that's why it was a worthwhile exercise for me when I was putting together this talk in the first place to try to steel man it, right? To try to give it as much benefit of the doubt as possible, so as to not. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this, to be clear, but what most Bitcoiners will do is just be like, "This is all bullshit." At the end, which is fine, by the way. But obviously, that would be like a 10-second talk and not, not going into more detail on it. So, I think the slides aren't up anymore. That's a shame. But there's a slide that is, I think that's just cycling through some. Can we get the slides back up? Yeah. So, but also what I was talking about at the time here, that the assumption in the content that I wanted to cover here is that, these people are not scamming or bullshitting. That's why I took off gambling and scams. And I think there is a huge amount of that in crypto, of people who are, really are well intended. They're trying to build something useful, and I think what I said in the talk was something like, they'll eventually realize that they'll probably have to bring it to Bitcoin to find the missing merit. But I think in particular the bottom row, the cryptography R&D, because you said you want to disregard the financial part for now. Yeah, there's it seems at least pretty obvious that there's massive technical merit, and if anything, this has been a bit of a struggle for Bitcoin, because historically, the people who I blame for all of this have done a far better job marketing. I mean, it's easy when you have a $1 billion budget because you're scamming people, but nonetheless, they've done a far better job marketing the appeal of working in the space to, like, academics, developers, and so on. Who, again, I've said, if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, I think I've been scammed as much as anybody else. But that a huge amount of the work that they have done seems like it potentially has applications, provided it can be brought to Bitcoin, because that will fill in the missing economic merit component. I think, I mean, you could have a whole talk about that. That probably I wouldn't even be the right person to give. But yes, if you're not minded to just be like, bullshit, scams, ignore it completely, I think you'll start to see a lot of this too. And I think maybe I actually didn't really mention this because this is now getting very nuanced, but I think that will be a pretty major difficulty this coming cycle for people who want to try to look for this sort of thing, that distinguishing the the combination of the real projects with the real technical merit and credibility, and also the the ethics of the team, right, that they were never really intending to scam anybody. Distinguishing that from the answer to your question, which is is like, oh, there's a layer 2, buy my token. That's probably going to become different. I mean, if they have a token, it's a very easy way of siphoning it out. But expecting these people to move over to Bitcoin and to find ways to implement it in that context, I think is obviously gonna happen. But to go right back to your question, that yes, there's a huge amount that has some merit, is well intended, but simply won't work in crypto for hopefully reasons that are now clear. Hopefully.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Alan, for the presentation. So it's lunchtime now. Take an hour and a half to go get some lunch, network, ask questions.
All right. I guess we'll kick it off. Looks like we've got as many as we're going to get. So the panel we were told to talk to you about today, picked by Plowman, is why is sovereignty important? So I will pose that question to each one of the panelists here. I might dodge it myself as the moderator, but I did, as I explained, I do want to open up the questions to the audience without the tech. We will just ask you to raise your hands, and I will pass you a microphone if you have a question that you want to ask. That way, your voice can be recorded and put together on the content that they are creating here. So, why, Adam? Is sovereignty important?
Sorry, I don't even have a mic.
There you go.
I don't really like this question. I don't know. Why is sovereignty important? I guess here's a way I can frame it that'll open up for maybe more interesting answers, more interesting questions too. That I'll rephrase the question ever so slightly to make it more interesting, which is why does it suck when you don't have sovereignty? Because I think that's a much more helpful way to even get into explaining Bitcoin to people. And actually, there was someone who came up and had a chat with me after my presentation, who was bemoaning. I'm just thinking if he's here. I don't think he's here. I could have just given the mic to him, but he was bemoaning how difficult he's found it trying to orange pill people. And obviously, I'm very sympathetic to this. I think probably I expect everyone here is that you've had a similar experience to this with people that you think ought to get it, maybe because you figure they're smart, I suppose, or they should have had experiences that lead them to this. But a lot of people just don't seem to, and my kind of stoic response to this, I get, or what I think of as stoic is, I think it's own meme now, right? It's like everyone buys Bitcoin at the price they deserve. It's a little bit defeatist, I guess, but it is probably also just largely true. But so getting back to the question though, so why is sovereignty important, or my rephrasing of it, why does it suck when you don't have it? I think that's the reason I prefer that framing, because the only way I think I've really had any success with this is not even so much to extol Bitcoin's own virtues, because I tend to, sometimes it works, but the majority of the time it feels to me, at least, that it's coming across as kind of too intellectual. It's just not something that people think about, right? People don't think about sound money or really anything about how the monetary system works, but pointing out to them ways in which they are gradually losing sovereignty seems, in my experience, to be far more effective as at least maybe not an entire orange pill. I don't know what quite the most apt metaphor is here. Is like a little sprinkling of the orange pill or something, but that's a great way of getting people to start asking questions. And that's actually exactly what this guy said, but about himself, that he got into Bitcoin in 2020, 21, not for anything really to do with money, at least not at first, but because of COVID and state government shenanigans around COVID. And he didn't obviously word it this way, but in line with the question, he could feel his own sovereignty being rapidly extinguished, basically, and started asking questions about that. And that led to Bitcoin. Now he's here. So that's why it matters, I guess.
Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, so the nice thing about talking second is that I can think about what Alan just said and kind of piggyback off that a little bit. I would say sovereignty is important because sovereignty is a type of liberty. Sovereignty is a type of freedom. If you are not sovereign over something, then you don't have liberty for that thing. And again, I guess you can always turn it back to the same way that Alan just turned it there, looking at it from the other way around. What's it like to not have liberty over something? Depends on what that thing is. Do you have liberty over my car, which is currently parked in Germany? No, you have no control over that whatsoever. You have no sovereignty, no control, and you probably don't care that much that you can't do anything with my car. But what if somebody came along now and tied you down in your seat so you don't have the ability to stand up? You no longer have the freedom, the liberty to stand up. You don't have sovereignty over your own body anymore at that point. How does that feel? That feels absolutely awful. And humans don't want to feel awful. We, as simple creatures, want to feel happy. We want to feel good. So having sovereignty over your money with Bitcoin is having the liberty to use your money in whatever way you choose. And that feels good. And ultimately, that's what most humans are trying to do. Avoid bad feelings and increase good feelings. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but ultimately, most actions that you take, most interactions, are because it's going to have positive effects on your own feelings in general.
Perfect. Alex, over to you.
Do I have to be the antagonist here?
Why not, sir?
Okay, I'm just gonna go for it. So I think sovereignty is a scam. So let's just come out of the gate with that. I don't think anybody's really that sovereign. Honestly, like sovereignty in the definition of the term is like to do with monarchs and states. You know, we've kind of like brought it down into self-sovereignty to some degree, but we are still highly dependent on the existence of the state and all of these things. You know, we might be, you know, we're in a country today, like we still had to fly through, we had to get our passports checked and all that sort of stuff. It's not very sovereign. So I think the discussion should be more about agency than sovereignty. I think that's more important. I think agency is the defining factor between someone who is like living and an NPC, right? And I don't know if anyone's ever read like the remnant essays that I did that pissed a lot of people off. But you know, in what I tried to describe there with the remnant essays was that most people don't want agency. They don't want sovereignty. And that's fine because most people are most people. You know, it's the lemmings, the masses, whatever you want to call them. And you know, the thing about sovereignty is it doesn't just come with liberties. You know, liberties is sort of one side of the equation. There's no such thing as a liberty without a responsibility, right? And you know, I think one of the biggest diseases we have in modern society is that we've got people out there calling themselves freedom maximalists, and a lot of Bitcoiners, in fact, most Bitcoiners are guilty of this shit. Is they're freedom maximalists, but they don't say anything about responsibility, right? Now, some of them try and live, you know, with a greater degree of responsibility, but I think responsibility is the thing that comes before freedom anyway. And responsibility is a weight, it's a burden. You know, agency is not free. Agency comes with a weight, it comes with an expectation. Sovereignty, likewise. You know, when no one is there to pick up after you, when if you make a mistake and no one is there to amend it for you, that's when you are leaning more in the direction of sovereignty or agency or responsibility or adulthood. So I think if we're going to have a discussion about, you know, why sovereignty is good, you know, it hinges around the more important discussion, which is why is agency good? And I think agency then ties into things like free will and why you're alive, why you're a human, and all of that. And I honestly don't think this sounds cruel, but I don't think that applies to all people. I really don't think some people want agency, or I really don't think some people act with agency. Like, and we saw that during the lockdowns. You know, I spent quite a bit of time in Germany during the lockdowns, and I just saw a lot of non-agency. And you know, we see it all over the place. I mean, even I'll do one other example, like Bitcoin and the carnival bullshit. Like, that's total non-agency. Like, I see it when, you know, Bitcoiners go to a restaurant and then they look around and just make sure that they also order the steak because the guy next to them ordered the steak and the guy next to them ordered the steak, so everybody orders fucking steak and they don't even like it. And do you know what I do? I eat the fucking pasta and the pizza and the burger because it tastes better and fuck the steak, right? So it's like, they just do it because everybody else does it. So I think, yeah, if anything, like, we need to talk about agency, and that's the little thread that I wanted to pull, so I'll just shut up.
Well, I guess then to kind of carry on with your thought process then, can we ever have sovereignty?
It's all a degree, right? Can you ever have freedom? I don't know. It's a degree of things, right? And I think those who have the capacity to carry greater responsibility should also have more sovereignty because they have more responsibility. So it's like it's a one thing comes before the other. Sovereignty is or agency is the benefit of having or taking responsibility.
It has to be earned.
Sorry?
It has to be earned.
It has to be earned, exactly. Yeah. Earned. And you can't just be given it. And that's another thing. It's like, you don't just get sovereignty. You become more sovereign by taking more agency, taking more responsibility, etc. And there's a degree to which the amount of responsibility or the amount of weight you can bear caps out. Like, when I was young in my 20s, I decided to try and run 4 businesses at once. I took on the responsibility for opening up offices everywhere. I had 100 people working for me. I was a fucking 23-year-old. I knew nothing about life. And in the end, all the businesses collapsed. And I lost everything, and I had to start again from 25, you know, and all this sort of stuff. So, like, I went beyond what my capacity to carry or beyond my, you know, ability to, I don't know, be sovereign at that point, whatever you want to call it. But so these things come with a cost. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I want to wanted to pick up on exactly this thread. Before I agree with Alex, though, I just want to clarify that I do not like steak. Like, if any of you see me eating a steak, it's because I like it. It's not. I didn't look around first. Although I do recognize that phenomenon, though it is quite funny. Yeah, I want to pick up on this this thread of Alex being mad at some of the rhetoric, let's say, in the Bitcoin community, to the extent such a thing even exists. Because I do agree that a lot of it is quite, I don't know the right way to put it, sort of simplistic, naive, maybe, in terms of purely touting freedom as if there's no, well, exactly as you put it, that it has to come with a responsibility. I push it in a slightly different direction, though, not to disagree with you, just to tease us out even further. And actually, I think I can do this in such a way that it ends on a big advert for Bitcoin, which is it's our responsibility to do that as panelists. That one of the side effects of focusing so much on freedom, and maybe even more so on sovereignty, I kind of got the impression that this maybe, you can respond to this obviously, but I don't mean to be putting words in your mouth, but this maybe informed your irritation with invoking the concept of sovereignty kind of too carelessly, let's say, is that kind of language, that rhetoric around, obviously it also stems from the sovereign individual, which is itself, a kind of a metaphor that has a lot of nuance to it, and I feel a lot of people who say this haven't probably read the book, or couldn't tell you that much about what it says. But a lot of the way that the sovereignty angle is used, and especially when freedom is wrote into it, tends to ignore, or in some cases even downplay, interactions that people have that, or rather dependencies. So social dependencies, the way people operate within social groups that are clearly restricting their freedom, right? But doing so very deliberately. It's not that they're being coerced in any way, it's that they're voluntarily giving up their freedom because they benefit from membership in the group in some other way. The way I want to spin this finally to get into to being an advert for Bitcoin is that you could, I would do it now, you could give a whole talk, write a whole book about this, about what kinds of institutions ought to have these properties and what really benefit the individuals involved, even maybe in some cases where they think they're doing it perfectly consensually, but it's actually kind of, it's toxic or whatever, it's not really benefiting them. They need to take more agency, as Alex would probably put it. The thread I want to just pull on to get to the Bitcoin advert, though, is that one of them that is probably one of the most important, let's say, or certainly for in the context of this conference, I think we probably all agree is the most important. From my perspective, I think it's most important is money. And so this is probably the main reason that I get irritated with what I picked up on as maybe Alex's irritation too about freedom maximalism, and not freedom maximalism itself, but the careless rhetoric only around emphasizing freedom, that money doesn't make sense other than as a social institution. It's exactly one of the institutions that I was, that's why I set it up this way. It's not something that you can make any coherent sense of without it's how it relates you to other people. And so the final point I wanted to get to, that I got all excited when Alex introduced all of these terms, is that what Bitcoin allows for the first time, and you can maybe talk about some elements of this with the gold standard, but Bitcoin is a new dimension of this, is in fact taking responsibility for your own money. It's enabling you to have agency rather than just, passively accepting that this is an institution. So it is necessarily to some extent a social institution, but one that you just have no agency in and you can't opt out of. You do now finally have that choice.
Yeah, so you stole about half of what I was going to say there, so that's good. It means we're pretty much on the same page. But I was also going to extend that a little bit into looking at how Bitcoin works at a more fundamental level. You have the idea of individual nodes who are, to use that term, self-sovereign. The nodes define how they behave and they define the rules and so on. But if I run a node and I set my rules to be different to everybody else's node, you know, I'm well within my power to do that. I can do that. But I am no longer running the same Bitcoin as everyone else. They will reject my transactions and I will reject their transactions, at which point I am unable to transact with anyone. So, as you point out there, Alan, money is a social phenomenon. You need at least two people for money to make any sense, and for it to make any practical sense, you need a lot more than two people. And in Bitcoin, the consensus algorithm is essentially the way that we come to an agreement on what Bitcoin is and how we behave and how we interact with each other. So I view Bitcoin very much as a set of social rules rather than this more, I guess you'd call it, the naive, individualistic approach of, you know, the sovereign, the freedom maximalists laughing at rather than actually understanding how it behaves. That's not to say individualism isn't important. You know, you should have the maximum amount of individual liberty to do what you want. I believe that very firmly. But maximal amount doesn't mean absolute, because you are a member of society. You know, I can maximally choose to run my node with completely different rules to everyone else, and then I will take the consequence of that action that I am unable to trade with anyone else. I'm unable to interact with anyone else. It's a pointless thing to do. So you are a member of society, and you have to, in some ways, in order to maximize your actual freedom, you need to give up some freedoms. You need to give up the freedom to, you know, say, I want to have a different Bitcoin consensus algorithm. I want there to be 42 million Bitcoin now instead of 21. You know, if I choose to do that, I'm actually limiting my own freedom, despite the fact that that was a free choice that I made. Yes.
Okay. Well, I will ask if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, in the front row here. Perfect. Here we go.
Right. I was wondering, when you were talking about sovereignty, sorry, the pronunciation is a bit hard. How do you think you explain this word to a little child? Yes, like, because I know that our Einstein, he said that if you understand something, you can explain it in the simplest way. So that's my question.
Yeah, I think that relates to getting rid of the word sovereignty and just thinking more about agency. And then to the kid, it's like, you can do what you want, but like, you know, play with the toys. But once you make a mess, you have to clean it up. You know, so or like making them aware that there's a cost to things somehow. Like, I don't know if anyone's got a better example, but like.
So, I'm not sure about you guys, but I'm a dad. I've got two kids, 13 and 10, and my entire life, even before Bitcoin existed, I subscribed to an anarchist philosophy, and that includes tearing down of hierarchies. I do not tell my kids, you do this because I said so. Ever. I tell my kids, you do this because if you want to have a positive outcome for yourself, that's the right thing to do. And I teach them through example. You know, if they make a huge mess in their room, I'll say, you should probably clean that up. And they'll think, and they'll be like, maybe today I won't. And then when it comes time to actually, you know, vacuum the floor or something, then some of their toys are magically disappearing because they were in the way. They can't find them anymore. So they learn that there are consequences to their actions, which are, you know, maybe outside of their control. And that's just the way the world works. Is it fair? Not necessarily, but the world is not a fair place, and I think it's ridiculous.
It's pretty fair. It's not equal.
It's fair. Yeah. The world is not always fair to you. It's definitely not always equal. And that's something which I think my kids have learned very well, and they are very capable now of making the right decisions based on me raising them that way. I'm not going to say I'm the perfect dad. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I think pretty much most dads do at some point, and I'm happy with how my kids have grown up. So I think it worked.
So, defining sovereignty, I would say something like, and as maybe not quite to a 5-year-old, but just as simply as I can come up with in maybe a political science context is something like you are sovereign if you can enact your will without appealing to the coercive power of somebody else. And everyone that you can enact it over is you are their sovereign. And again, just to go back to how this is the word, the concept, etc., I think is kind of abused in a lot of Bitcoin rhetoric because of the book, The Sovereign Individual. But again, the title of that book is intended to be evocative. The TLDR of the book in like one sentence or something is that they're predicting that due to technological shifts, one of which Bitcoin's actually a perfect example of, even though it was written well before Bitcoin. I think that's why people like it so much. But that due to technological shifts, the ability for states, who are typically like the most obvious candidate for a sovereign, to enact that kind of violence on individuals, to impose their will on individuals, will reduce, and therefore individuals will be less subject to the sovereignty of states. I don't know if that was a simple definition, but it's the simplest, at least, that I can come up with. Yeah. But I mean, I can link it to a few other things. So, Ben's comments just there that you might want to correct this. I'm not sure if you favor phrasing it this way, but I mean, your kids are clearly not sovereign, given the way that you've set up that nothing to do with the state or anything, but at least with respect to you have some sovereignty over them. But also, it sounds like you're putting a lot of thought into how to what's the best way of putting this? I don't know. Motivate their own acceptance of their own agency or something like that to bring that distinction back again. So that's an interesting way of thinking about the application.
I actually think that falls back a lot to what Alex was saying about responsibility. I do not view myself as having sovereignty over my kids. I view myself as having a responsibility towards them, and that responsibility includes occasionally things which they're not going to like. But it's still, I view it as a responsibility, not as sovereignty over them.
That makes perfect sense. I also wanted to tie it to your the comments about the nodes, and so viewing Bitcoin from that more granular technical sense, that if you're clear on that concept of sovereignty, I think it maybe sheds some light, or it's just an interestingly different perspective on what you can and can't do within Bitcoin. So you're obviously free to just run your own fork, but nobody else has to. You are not, however, free to force anyone else to run that fork and stay in consensus. And so it does raise quite interesting issues about what aspect of sovereignty is even really relevant here, given, again, as we've all touched on this now, that you need to, I guess in a technical sense, you need to remain in consensus. In a more philosophical sense, the way I put it before, you need to acknowledge that you are part of a community, right? That this is an institution that can only function with cooperation.
Actually, if I can piggyback on that, there's a nice little idea of ownership of land. And I think most of us would agree you can own a bit of land. Yeah, you can own some land and you can do what you want on your land in general. There might be some restrictions around killing people or something. Anyone who comes onto your land, you decide to kill them, is probably frowned upon in most cases. But let's say I own a house, and around that house there are some roads. In fact, all four sides. And then Daniel here goes and buys those roads. And he says anybody who uses my roads has to pay this ridiculously high toll. Did he or did he not just limit some of my sovereignty and some of my freedoms? I didn't own those roads. I had no power over them. They just happened to be the roads that were around my house. I own my house and I'm sovereign over that house. I'm free to do whatever I want in that house. But now he owns the roads around my house. I can't even leave without paying this huge toll. Did he limit my sovereignty? Did he limit my freedom? That's where the social aspect of the whole thing comes into it. I think the point that Alex here was making is that the words are not the correct words to be using for that discussion. It muddies things and it makes things confusing if you use the wrong words to describe it. I can absolutely say that he limited my freedom to do particular things in that scenario. But should we limit his ability to do that? These are difficult social questions. How do we behave as a society towards each other? And I'm not going to propose an answer here right now. I don't think this is the right discussion for that, because that goes into 1,000 different little rabbit holes. But I think that's an interesting thing for everyone to kind of think about.
And any other questions from, yes, Rado. And this is going to Svetsky.
Don't have to. I have a monopoly on questions.
Well, you haven't spoken.
I'm obviously a big believer in Bitcoin and how it can change the world. But I'm also very worried about that it's not enough. Like you mentioned, not all people want to be sovereign, or not all people want to be responsible. So we know there is only a small amount of people that we need to change things. However, I want to ask this question about how do you see, like, if we are not active in trying to change, and we all know governments, the way they're currently operating, are corrupt, and that system is not sustainable, and it's going to change. The problem I have is, are we going to change it, or are we going to wait for somebody to change the system for us, and then we'll end up into a new system that's still not what we want, right? So how would you approach that, and what else do we need to do other than Bitcoin?
Very good question. I literally spent the last 2 years of my life writing a book to answer that question. So, at 5 o'clock today, I'm going to talk about this specific topic, and talk about, and basically announce for the first time the book that I've been working on. But it asked the question of, okay, what happens when Bitcoin wins? Because I think, economically speaking, Bitcoin's going to win. You know, you can't. Fiat is just a loser, right? And it's like the thing that's going to lose in the face of Bitcoin. It just doesn't. It can't compete. It's just a matter of time. And I don't know whether that's 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. At some point, Bitcoin comes out on top. The question then is, who do we become? You know, so you've got the argument for the Bitcoin standard, and then you've got the question of, when we're on a Bitcoin standard, do we become a new parasitic political class? Do we become a bunch of Lambo driving degenerates? You know, or do we become men and women of virtue? And it's not clear to me that we just automatically become men and women of virtue, because you look at a lot of people who made a lot of money out of Bitcoin early on, they generally become degenerates more often than not. There is a small cohort of people that have looked to become more sovereign, more responsible, etc., etc. But I would actually argue that's more the minority than it is the majority. A lot of people, when they come into money, when they elevate their socioeconomic status in a short period of time, they generally become more political, or they generally become more parasitic. You know, one of those sorts of things. So I spent freaking 2 years looking at this question and said, all right, what were the greatest civilizations throughout history, and what were the cultures that preceded them? Because culture is upstream of civilization. And then I said, okay, who are these cultures? What were the behaviors? What were the virtues that were central to these cultures? And I looked at the Japanese, the samurai. I looked at the West, the Faustian West, so like medieval, feudal West. I looked at the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Macedonians. I looked at all of these different cultures, and I found an overlap of virtues. And virtues are very different to values. Values are something you desire. Virtues are something you do. So virtues are more behaviors. And I created like a list of 10 virtues that are really important. To me, virtues even transcend beliefs. So you've got like, you can have different religions, but all of them generally respect virtues like courage, or justice, or compassion, or respect, or loyalty, or responsibility, or excellence. So I've got these things, and it's I guess where I'm going to as an answer to this is that it needs to be more than just Bitcoin. It needs to be our behavior, and our behavior needs to be at least oriented around these virtues or these behaviors that seem to have preceded the greatest cultures and the greatest civilizations on Earth beforehand. And I'm not saying that these are the only virtues, but I've listed 10 which have a very strong overlap between cultures that were not even connected. You look at the chivalric West and the Japanese samurai, they had very very similar virtues, and they were never in contact with each other. And they all emerged through a particular class, which was the warrior class, which I believe that's where you get the highest virtues, because that's the most ascendant class, and it's the one that inspires the lower classes, and it's the one that defends the higher classes. It's actually the standout one. Funny thing, an anecdote, is that in the modern world, we've actually we've diminished the importance of the warrior class, and we've turned everything more into a civilian, commercial, trader, merchant class, and that's why we're run by bankers today. You would, yeah, there's a whole rabbit hole there which I should not get into. But anyway, my talk this afternoon is going to be a little bit about that. But thank you for bringing that up, because that is extremely important. That's the thing that we need to be thinking of next, because in many ways, like, Bitcoin will take care of itself. It's going to win. It's going to suck in more and more economic mass. It's going to do that. We need to start now inculcating or developing these virtues in ourselves and in our children, etc., because we are going to be the class of people that rule the world. I'm sorry to say that's what's going to happen, and we need to accept that gift and the responsibility for that. And this sort of comes back to agency, sovereignty, and responsibility. It's like the duty is going to be on us to structure the world in a new way, because the fabric of civilization is going to completely change. Things, the way they operate now, the playbook for a fiat standard is lie, cheat, steal, fucking, get into politics, get into, all this sort of stuff so you can take advantage of the system. The playbook on a Bitcoin standard is going to be completely different, because it's a different framework. And my argument is that that playbook is going to require the development of these virtues.
So I don't want to give a direct answer to the question, just because I don't think I'd give one anywhere near as good as Alex just did, and we can all go watch his talk at 5, right? Yeah, wonderful. What I do want to do, though, is just emphasize how important I think the question is, and that I would encourage people to ask this, and to, in turn, encourage others to ask it as well. In part because, I feel like, maybe I don't know about you guys, but for me at least, this is sort of turning into, this panel, as it is turning into just me whining about which Bitcoin memes I dislike the most. But one of them, honestly, is this idea. It's not really explicit. It's not a meme exactly, but it's something that I think you can infer from a lot of the way Bitcoiners talk, as treating Bitcoin as an end rather than as a means. Yeah. So to me, seemingly to Alex as well, I saw you nodding as well, but probably to everybody on this panel, it's far healthier to treat it as a means. And I guess you can still link it to, without giving an explicit answer of what behavior should you look to enact once we're on the Bitcoin standard. Alex, is kind of shying away from giving the answer explicitly. I think in your case, it'll just because it's quite complicated. You're going to give a talk on it anyway. You've written a whole book on it. What I'll say on that point, though, without giving an answer, but like an appropriate way as to how you would arrive at an answer, is that what moving towards Bitcoin standard gives you is link it with the previous answer too, via taking responsibility for your own money. That enables you to take responsibility for many, many other things in a way that previously you couldn't, because that time, if that's the way you want to think of it, that time was being stolen from you in such a way that made you have to think about money all the time, or have to think about things that are downstream of you, living within a system in which money is deeply unfair and forces you to think that way. I think the connection is provided that you are clear on this just being a means. The connection is that the means it gives you is more time and more responsibility to think about what the end even should be in the first place. I think if you think of Bitcoin as the end, you kind of haven't got anywhere. I think the early degenerates who now have Lambos and whatever else, I don't know if they put it this way exactly, but I think to them Bitcoin was the end, or at least riches was the end. But that's not the message that we want to get across.
I'm going to agree with 95% of what you said and push back on 5%. I don't think there is an end. Society is something you do, not something that you aim for. I think anyone who says this is the end goal of society is deluding themselves and probably deluding a few people around them. Generally speaking, you can have goals, but I would actually encourage unattainable goals. And what I mean by that is, let's say if we wanted to define the scientific approach to things, we could say the goal of science is to know everything knowable. And it will never get there. It's literally impossible. There's actually even proofs that it is actually literally impossible to even get there. You've got incompleteness theorem, for example. Gödel's incompleteness theorem tells you that you can't know everything. And I think we should treat society in the same kind of way. We should have unattainable goals that are a direction to head towards. And I think that's kind of where Alex was going with the virtues. I wouldn't frame it like that, because I think virtues are often disagreed upon, as in both two people can say the same word for a virtue and then strongly disagree on what actually matches that virtue in terms of behavior. And that itself is very problematic. Actually, to give a really good example, the COVID lockdowns, one of those horrible things that I'd say most people really didn't like very much. The people who were in favor of the lockdowns actually framed it in terms of freedom. I want the freedom to not be infected by you breathing your COVID-infected breath on me. So they were in favor of freedom. And the people against the lockdowns, which includes me, by the way, just to be clear on that, wanted the freedom to not be locked in their houses. But either way, both are talking about it in terms of freedom. You don't actually, and this is true with a lot of things, you have to be really careful about how you use words because of that. People will agree on the words that you use while drastically disagreeing on the actual behaviors that lead to that. So, all respect to the whole virtues idea, but I think we need to be very careful with how we frame those things so that we can actually have more productive discussions about what do we actually need to do, rather than just, hey, we're in favor of this particular thing. Respect, for example. What does respect actually mean? Very different things to different people. Different peoples of different religions, for example. Does respecting the other person's religion mean allowing them to practice it freely in the open? What if that religion involves blood sacrifice of kittens? Are you going to allow people to slice kittens' throats on the streets of Sofia? Probably not. Or maybe you will. It depends on your own preferences. But there are going to be some people strongly against that. There's going to be some people strongly for it. So, and both of them will frame that in terms of respect. So, we need to be careful with the understanding of the word, the behaviours, not just the high-level view.
Be careful of the virtue signalers.
Oh, yeah.
I would say. Many of those in COVID times as well, especially those that were locking themselves away for my safety. No, please come outside. Jacob.
Thank you, Dan. Guys, we're talking about the importance of self-sovereignty. I want to kind of ask a question around, the fact that anybody buying Bitcoin through a centralized exchange has to KYC themselves. At some point, every exchange can be hacked, or the governments can say, "Hey, we know how much you actually bought, and now is the time under this very special circumstances that we need you to pay 90% tax on that." How do you relate this to sovereignty, please?
Just because I'm holding the mic, I'll answer first, and I can give a really short answer. Avoid trading fiat for Bitcoin as much as possible, and just start earning it. Earn Bitcoin, spend Bitcoin, stay out of the fiat system. Obviously, it's not entirely possible. You can't always do that. But the more we do that, the less we need to deal with all of the crap that goes around fiat.
Do you have a talk about that? You want to share?
Yeah, so tomorrow I'm giving a talk in the other room there called Living on a Bitcoin Standard, and kind of cover the what, the why, the how. So that's tomorrow.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is obviously it is a good idea for your own sake to try to take these measures and whatever else Ben talks about tomorrow. I look forward to it. Another thing you can keep in mind though is that as you do that, there's obviously lots of different ways of implementing this, but you normalize it for other people as well. which I think is super useful. And in some cases, it can be obviously quite intangible, and just like you happen to tell someone, family member, friend, whatever, that I'm earning in Bitcoin, and they say, oh, didn't know that was a thing, and then it can hopefully you're planting a seed that can grow from there. There could be other cases though. I wouldn't want to get too kind of bogged down in technical commercial details, whatever, but where it does still require some or other service. It's just structured in such a way that there's no KYC involved, in which case you're far more tangibly helping by supporting that. It could be a business, but it doesn't need to be, but just providing your I was gonna say like your liquidity, I guess. It's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but what I'm getting at is that in all of the different ways you can go about this, there are benefits beyond yourself that are maybe even more of a reason to want to do it.
Yes.
I have no idea how long this panel's going to go for, so we'll just keep going as long as we can until the plowman comes in and throws us out. So if you've got any further questions.
I've got a follow-up question.
A follow-up question. Always appreciated.
Do you envisage that at some point in the near future there will be a different price for a KYC Bitcoin versus non-KYC Bitcoin?
Good one. Maybe.
I would agree on maybe, but I'm going to lean towards probably not, just because I think there are enough people who are willing to do the hard yards to kind of make them the same. So, I personally don't treat them that differently from each other, but if, for example, somebody was to give me some heavily KYC Bitcoin, from an employer or something, and I see that they bought it from a particular exchange or something like that, then, I will take the work to essentially obfuscate that as much as possible, coin joins and so on. And at that point, it's clean again, or maybe you could say it's all dirty at that point, and I don't care either way. If somebody doesn't want to take my Bitcoin from me, then that's their problem more than mine.
Any further thoughts?
I usually pay a little bit more for non-KYC Bitcoin, which, if that means anything, is premium then. I guess it kind of depends on the buyer or the seller, right? So, the thing about non-KYC Bitcoin, there's no real market for it, right? Like, that just sort of happens at the edges. Like, as in, there's no market price. So, like, if you and I do a trade now, we're not broadcasting it to the world. It's not KYC. So I'm sure that, if we could somehow measure all of it, the non-KYC stuff probably goes for a slight premium. But the whole point of it is that you can't measure it, so you can't have market price for it. So,
does it increase your sovereignty?
I mean, it has some sort of positive impact, I assume, because once again, like, if we tie that back to agency. Well done, Dan. The brilliant panel moderator here, tying it back. I mean, I guess it does anything that increases your agency in any way. Seems to me that it increases your sovereignty. I don't know if anyone has a more eloquent answer, but yes,
I think it's probably a good answer. Yeah. Any other questions at all, guys, before we wrap this one up? Yeah.
So I had a similar question regarding we're talking about the sovereignty, right? But at the same time, like the history knows periods when, for example, governments required people to turn in their gold, for instance, right? We know some countries in the world right now ban Bitcoin. That can have certain consequences on citizens, right? So how do you envision these kinds of scenarios, or not envision? And how does Bitcoin help or not help in these situations? I mean, for example, if we also know that certain corporations are getting more and more Bitcoin, etc. And at some point, let's imagine Bitcoin is banned and everybody has to turn in their Bitcoin. So what happens? What do you think?
So to me, this is one of those societal questions. We were talking about society a bit before. There's the old meme, Bitcoin fixes this. Bitcoin fixes a lot of things. Bitcoin helps fix a lot of things. But on its own, Bitcoin doesn't automatically fix a bunch of stuff. We need to work on other things, and society in general is one of them. How we shape the world around us, how we interact with each other. And so personally, if I lived in a country and they banned Bitcoin, I have the ability to leave that country. I have the ability to move and to escape. Not everyone has that. There are people in places of the world where that's literally impossible. Men with guns will stop them from leaving. And what can we do about that right now? Probably nothing. The best they can do is hide their Bitcoin, not let people know they have it, and wait for a better world. But we can't solve every problem all the time, and I think that is just one of those realities that we do have to live with. But as long as we, like I was saying before, as long as we're trending in the right direction, as long as we have a goal, even if it's, especially if it's an impossible goal, that we work towards as a world. Start on your local scale, because local is what grows larger. Start on your local scale and build a better world around you, and eventually we won't have horrible men with guns trying to take people's Bitcoin away or stopping them. But in the short term at least, it's going to happen, and there's probably not a great deal we can do.
Yeah, this is once again another Bitcoin meme I don't like so much that I can rip into a little bit. I think that situation is very much, I was going to say it's overblown, not so much in the sense that it's unlikely it would happen. I mean, it's already happened in several places, but more the link to Bitcoin in the first place and how you ought to interpret it and how you ought to think about it. I think if you just take Bitcoin out of the picture just for a second to set up the scenario, if what you're talking about is widespread confiscation of property, and in particular property that is, seen to be politically incorrect, if you want to put it that way, or adversely affects the sovereignty of the state doing the confiscation, I think you've got far bigger problems there to begin with before you even need to introduce Bitcoin. And I think the relevance of Bitcoin isn't, oh, it's so great that it's made them so mad that they would do this. It's how are you protected in a situation where something like that can happen to you in the first place. And so I see this as actually being incredibly positive. I don't see like a 6102 scenario as being negative for Bitcoin per se. It's obviously negative for the people it's happening to, but it's a property of the state doing it, not of Bitcoin itself. Bitcoin enables you to, as Ben's mentioned, obviously not perfectly, right, but quite well protect yourself from this happening. And so I don't really see that there's from the perspective of what you need to say about it for focusing it on Bitcoin, I don't really think there is that much. It's just it's a tool. It's a means, right? It's a means rather than an end. The end, I guess, being escaping tyranny in the first place.
I'll just add something to that. When you look back at the Executive Order 6102, and if something was to happen, and just to fill people in that don't understand what that was, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he signed the Executive Order 6102, which made it illegal to hoard gold. So what was he going after? The low-hanging fruit, the big companies, the big institutions. So if we were to see something similar in Bitcoin, the low-hanging fruit is Sailor and the ETFs.
Well,
right?
It's Coinbase. Sailor doesn't have any Bitcoin.
It's Coinbase, correct. It's Coinbase, or it's Gemini, or it's the ETFs. It's BlackRock and whoever else. Just keep your head down. You don't have to go crawling into the government office with your hardware wallet or do that with a dummy one and just turn around and say, well, thanks, this Bitcoin thing was nice and I'm sure it's going to be dead and nobody will be talking about it in 2 years' time, and then move country on the quiet. I see you guys have I think we do have to wrap it up. So, Alan?
Or just in that scenario, or the LeBen, just say, it's time locked, sorry.
Right.
Oh well. Wish I could.
All right, guys, we will wrap it up here, but you can carry on a conversation with any of these guys. It's very easy to grab them out in the hall here. So thank you very much for listening.
So our next guest is another fellow Brit. Although his accent is far posher than mine, I think we'll all agree. And you'll probably have absolutely no problem understanding him, but he does have slides too. And he's here representing as well the Bitcoin Policy Institute in the UK, which was Freddie's initiative to set up, which is a great initiative because he's trying to bring the conversation to the table of the policymakers in the UK and kind of replicate what happened in the US with the Bitcoin Policy Institute over there as well. So he's going to come up here and talk about CBDCs. So Freddie, please take the stage.
Thanks, mate.
Good luck, mate.
Thanks, Daniel, for a very kind intro, and thanks also to Plamen and all of the team here. It's great to be in Bulgaria. It's my first time, so thank you very much for the warm welcome. And congratulations as well, because out of maybe 120 countries that are currently trialing CBDCs, Bulgaria is not one of them. So well done, everyone. Which is good news. So one question that we might want to get out of the way first, why are we talking about CBDCs at a Bitcoin conference? And we've heard several times during the course of the morning that Bitcoin, like all monies, is of course just a tool. And in juxtaposition to CBDCs, it's a tool that enables you, as much as you can, to preserve your freedom to transact in a way that CBDCs are unlikely to do so. In case anyone's unfamiliar with what they are conceptually, we've stuck up on the slide, they're of course a digital form of money that's issued by central banks. The problem is that they will grant governments a huge level of control over what you do with your money and how you spend it. And I'd like to hark back to something actually that Daniel said in his presentation earlier, if you caught that, about the nature of money in the modern economy. There are really two kinds at the moment. The first is central bank money, and the way that most of us encounter central bank money is in the form of banknotes. And that's a liability of the central bank. You may have seen in various different countries around the world, that's often written on the note itself. I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of $10, £10, €10. The other form of money, which actually forms the majority of money in the modern system, is actually created by commercial banks when they make loans. And that type of money is also a liability, but that's a liability of those commercial banks themselves. So obviously, looking at the first point there, a digital currency, most money actually at the moment is digital. You'll probably notice that over the last few years, there's been a continuous decrease in the use of and the demand for physical cash. And remember, the physical cash is the central bank liability. And actually, while we're on the subject, I'm quite a fan of physical cash. Physical cash has got a very good level of privacy. No one can know what you do with a $10 note, a €10 note. And it's got a very low level of government control. Very, very few people can tell you what to do with a £10 note, a €10 note, a $10 note once it's in your pocket. Governments obviously don't like that, and I'm not the first person to say this, that if we invented cash today, it would probably be banned immediately. And privacy and government control are two things that are very, very important to think about when we're moving towards a more digital currency. If our currency is entirely digital, it's very easy for governments to surveil and to monitor what we do, and it's very easy for them to control it as well. So the key risk that I want to highlight in this presentation is the fact that a shift to a central bank digital currency, if it's done in the way that we think is likely to happen, will result in both a loss of privacy and an increase of government control. Small anecdote, the reason there's a Facebook logo up on the screen is because, like most of the worst things in the world, the governments and central banks' current interest in CBDCs started at Facebook. I don't know if you remember, in 2018, Facebook tried to create a stablecoin, which was called DM, or Libra. And that, prior to that, actually, most central banks had no interest whatsoever in Bitcoin. They wrote it off as an irrelevance. An investment with, as we heard earlier, no intrinsic value, their favorite phrase. But when Facebook came out with a gigantic pre-built user base, that got central banks absolutely terrified. And as a result, we see the 120 odd countries around the world all eagerly trying to create one so that they can surveil and control us. So this is one of my favorite chaps. So I thought whenever we're talking about these things, I think it's always useful to hear what their proponents say rather than their opponents. So we've got a couple of clips interspersed in the presentation today. This man is Augustin Carstens. As you can see, he's clearly a well-fed man, which is good. And he's a big fan of CBDCs now. And we'll listen.
We tend to establish the equivalence with cash And there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability.
Well, he got a bit distracted looking down, I suppose, at his next meal there. But I'm a horrible person, sorry. The most important thing, I think, is what he said there at the end. The central bank will have absolute control over the use of that expression of central bank liability. And I think it's always important, when someone tells you who they are, you need to believe them. The BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, if you don't already know, is effectively the central bank of central banks. In the same way that a central bank within a nation state operates as a settlement institution for all of the different banks within that nation state, the Bank of International Settlements performs the same function for all central banks worldwide. So they have an incredibly important and integral function within the worldwide banking system. And for the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements to say quite openly and unashamedly that their aim is to know who's using that $100 bill, if it's in digital form, and to have absolute control over how it is used, I think it's very important for all of us as citizens in, hopefully free and democratic countries to ask, is that exactly how you want to live your life and how you want your money to be treated? You get up every day, you go to work, you work hard for your money, you come home, you get paid at the end of the month, and then you find that a third party has got control over your funds and can determine how you spend them and how you use them. It's not the kind of world that I want to live in, and I hope it's not the kind of world that you want to live in either. So we've already touched on a few of these issues here, but I just want to break out a few of them while we have them on the slide. So surveillance and control, we already know is a key issue with these, and we've elaborated a little bit under column 1 there, a few of the things that we might be able to, the governments might be able to enforce if these things come into play. A key one really that I wanted to focus on, quite a simple example, that CBDCs effectively allow punishment before proof. So it's a key tenet of most liberal democracies that if I've committed a crime, the government then needs to prove that in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt. Using an example as simple as a parking fine, if all of your money is in the form of a CBDC and your local council decides that you have parked illegally, they will be able to debit that money from your CBDC account instantly. Very simple. And then subsequently you'll have to contest that. At the moment, you get a ticket. And then you can appeal that ticket before the money has actually left your account. And if you're at all like me, I've appealed a number of tickets and they've said, oh, actually, you did park legally, don't worry about it at all. If we invert the presumption of innocence, that I think is a very, very dangerous step for any society to take. And as with all of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, this is something that can inevitably snowball. Today may be fine, you may live in a liberal democracy. But as we know, in Europe, our history over the last 150, 200 years has shown that liberal democracies are not immune to collapse and to increasing levels of authoritarian control. It's just an unfortunate fact of human history. If you put a rule in today that is fine, there's no guarantee that it will be fine tomorrow. So we should be very careful about the rules and systems and structures that we create. Erosion of privacy, a fairly obvious one. I don't need to enumerate for you the vast numbers of different data leaks that seem to occur on an almost daily basis. The biggest one I saw recently was, I think, Ticketmaster, which incredibly leaked the details of 500 million people. It's worth stopping and thinking about that for a second. That's more than the population of the United States. It's 0.5 billion people's detail is now available for sale on the dark web. That happened just a few days ago. And given the fact that governments can't do IT, I'm almost certain that if we have a CBD system, there will be catastrophic leaks of personal data. Coercion and censorship, I think this is quite worrying, and this is something where very often you sound like a bit of a conspiracy theorist when you say this happened. But again, an example from a liberal democracy in the form of Canada. You're probably all aware of the Canadian truckers' protest, where we had, in a liberal democracy, a protest that may not have been to the taste of the government, but was nevertheless legal. Not only were the bank accounts of the protesters themselves frozen, the bank accounts of people who donated to those protesters were frozen. So again, think about this for a moment. If you make a political donation to an opposition party, and the party in power decides that they don't want that opposition party to have funds, very, very easy for them to switch off your money. And I'm afraid that switching off money is it's a prime weapon in the authoritarians' toolkit. There's a playbook that authoritarians tend to follow whenever they come to power. They attack the courts, they attack the free press, and they attack your ability to transact freely. If they can shut down your money, they can shut you down as well, very, very easily. So we have another of my friends. This one is Aswar Prasad. He is at the IMF, and he has some interesting things to say about programmability, which would enable
It's not just about digital forms of physical currency. You can have programmability, units of central bank currency with expiry dates. You could have, as I argue in my book, a potentially better and some people might see it, or a darker world where the government decides that units of central bank money can be used to purchase some things, but not other things that it deems less desirable.
Right. I find that extraordinarily concerning, particularly his weird little smile when he's telling us these horrible things. You could have units of central bank money that can be used to purchase some things, but not other things. Segueing slightly into a conceptual consideration of what money is, for me that really undermines the whole idea of money is fungible. One unit of money should be indistinguishable from any other unit of money. He's describing a world where the government may have designated food money and water money, and you wouldn't be able to use your water money to buy food. Again, this is not the kind of world that we want to acquiesce to. So obviously a lot of the things I've said so far don't sound too good about central bank digital currencies, and as a result, governments are beginning to come up with different ways of persuading us that they are a good idea, actually. And financial inclusion is another one of those. Financial inclusion, I think, is one of the buzzwords that people will often use, like everyone wants to look after their children, everyone wants clean water and clean air, everyone wants financial inclusion. And look, we've got 1.7 billion people around the world who don't have bank accounts, who can't access the financial system. Wouldn't it be great if they all had bank accounts as well? Unfortunately, as soon as you start digging into exactly how these systems work, you realize that this is at best mistaken and at worst an outright falsehood. The main reason that most people don't have bank accounts is because they don't have ID and they don't have a fixed address. Every single CBDC system that we're looking at the moment seems to require the provision either of your ID or of your address. And to give you an example of one of the most well-advanced ones, the e-Naira, which is the currency in Nigeria, the digital currency that they've been pushing very, very hard for people to adopt. There are different tiers of access that you get in the e-Naira wallet. The most basic one requires your phone number to be submitted, but if you only give your phone number, you can't really use any meaningful amount of money. So they limit your access and they limit the functionality of the money in that wallet. If you provide the most KYC that you possibly can, then finally the money becomes useful. And again, tracking back to what I just said about the fungibility of money, this is an extraordinary idea. You're effectively trading the functionality of the money that the government gives you by paying with your own KYC details, which again, as we know, because governments can't do IT, they will almost certainly leak. Oh, I like this one. So this chap also worked for the IMF alongside Aswar Prasad. He's very excited about limiting the kind of people that can have money and what you can spend it on.
Way we think CBDC can improve financial inclusion is through what we call programmability. That is, CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contracts, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized. For example, for food.
So again, CBDCs can be precisely targeted as to what kind of people can use them and to what you can use it for. Again, I wish I was making this up. None of the people whose clips I've played you are opponents of CBDCs. They are all proponents of them. They support the idea. And I think it's very, very important to listen very seriously to what these people are saying about the systems that they're designing. So on the subject of systems, very briefly, there are a couple of ways of creating this. A token versus account. The account model would be more similar to our modern bank accounts, and that would be a centralized system with likely some form of a spreadsheet in much the same way as a modern bank account works. Now, as we know at the moment, governments and central banks are absolutely obsessed with blockchain, but not in the way that we understand it. As you'll remember if you caught Alan Farrington's talk earlier, the only good use that we've discovered for a blockchain is the creation of a non-state digital money, which is decentralized and distributed, and is very, very hard to edit. As we know, if you want to add new transactions to the Bitcoin blockchain, an enormous cost, both in hardware and in energy, is imposed on you. A centralized blockchain, as we know, is largely pointless. The ability of a central bank to amend the ledger, to change the sequence of transactions, even to freeze them, is effectively costless. So we think it is most likely that we will end up with a centralized blockchain run by the central bank, potentially on a token model. There are token models that I would have less problem with. For example, if you're familiar with the concept of Xiaomi eCash, that is a tokenized model which enables reasonably good privacy and reasonably good transaction speed and transaction finality as well. For this reason, though, I think it's pretty unlikely that central banks will adopt a Xiaomi eCash model. So it's far more likely to be run on a centralized blockchain, which can be easily amended and controlled using some form of a token system, again, controlled and run by the central banks. And again, because this doesn't sound particularly attractive, we're going to see a lot of adoption incentives. One, again, to mention Nigeria. In Nigeria, they were offering discounts for payment with CBDCs in taxi rides. In Thailand, during their CBDC trial, the government airdropped certain type digital baht to various participants in the trial with a couple of interesting conditions. Those Thai baht could only be spent within a certain geographic location and only within a certain time. They had an expiry date on them. And again, coming back to the fungibility point around money, the idea that you could have money in your bank account which could expire within 6 weeks is pretty extraordinary when you begin to think about it, particularly if you had to work for the preceding 6 weeks in order to earn it. But we're going to see more and more of these kind of incentives as we go forward. And as we've seen in China, the People's Republic of China, those are likely to be integrated with your social credit system, and there will be various different incentives. I've already mentioned the cheaper taxi fares. It's likely that you will be able to get better deals on things like insurance products, or airfares, or railway tickets. And the idea behind this flywheel is to create a feedback loop, such as they gradually eliminate cash, they push people further and further towards the CBDC. And perhaps the last example from Nigeria. I've got nothing against Nigeria. I grew up in Southern Africa myself, so they seem to have done a lot of these trial systems ahead of a lot of the rest of the world. They tried to eliminate cash as much as humanly possible. Firstly via what they called a redesignation or a redesign of the currency, and then by forcible elimination of cash from cash machines, which, given that Nigeria was predominantly a cash system at the time, caused a huge amount of distress in the country. And they did that partly because the adoption of their CBDC had been very low, about 0.2% at the time. After they had forced everyone into using the CBDC, adoption moved up to about 6%, and they declared this a massive success, and that the CBDC was now the currency of choice, which is an interesting choice of words if you force people to use it. But this is why I don't work for a central bank. So what can we actually do about this to try and end on a sort of more positive note? Both Daniel earlier this morning and I mentioned earlier that commercial banks actually derive a lot of benefit from their ability to create money. And I've stuck up on the slide a few risks that commercial banks might face if they stop being able to issue the digital money that currently circulates within our system. People may pull their money out. Banks may have less lending business. There may be higher borrowing costs if, for example, one of the incentives for adopting a CBDC is that you can borrow from the central bank at a lower rate. So we think at our organization there's potential alliance to be made here with various commercial banks who will push back against CBDCs. And what can we do as individuals, as people? I've split this into protest and prepare. Protest is something we can do right now. Politically, there is a lot of pushback across the world against these things, and I personally find that relatively encouraging. Where we're seeing the most pushback at the moment is actually in the United States. Fortunately, there are a lot of very motivated senators and representatives there who are pushing through bills right at the moment. Tom Emmer, I recommend you follow him on Twitter. He's very good on this subject. He has recently pushed through a bill. It's called the Anti-CBDC Surveillance Bill. That's now been passed by the House of Representatives, and that effectively forbids the Fed ever from creating a CBDC. In the UK, one of Rishi Sunak's recent policies was to allow the ability for the government to monitor absolutely everyone's bank accounts at all times with extraordinary ease, much more easily than they currently do. Ostensibly, they were doing that in order to monitor welfare payments. But the bill as drafted would have allowed them eventually to expand that surveillance out to everyone's bank accounts. That has also been pulled. Parliament's now dissolved. That will not be passed, at least not in the previous Parliament. Legally, there are a few things we can do as well. Augustine Carson's our fat friend from the first clip. He has expressed a considerable distress with the fact that most countries' laws don't currently allow them to create CBDCs. Personally, I think that's a good thing. Augustine and I are not on the same page, although there probably wouldn't be room for us both at the same time. So in order for us to create a CBDC in the UK, whose policies I know best, we would need to pass an act of parliament. And the more political pressure that we in the UK can put on our MPs and our representatives, the greater chance we have of making it an electoral risk for them to adopt them. I've mentioned the Human Rights Act, the ECHR on the slide. There are two articles that I think are quite interesting there. One is Article 8, and that's the right to privacy, which is arguably substantially harmed by most countries' CBDC plans. And the other is Article 10, which is the right to freedom of expression. And if you read Article 10 in detail, it actually refers to the transmission of information. And I don't think this has been tested yet legally, but there's an interesting line of thought there that the transmission of a Bitcoin transaction is effectively no more than the transmission of information, the broadcast of a transaction to the network. So I think there's an interesting point there to be made around whether or not the transmission of a Bitcoin transaction would fall under Article 10, and potentially other forms of monetary transmission as well. And then personally, something as simple as writing to your representative. We have with Big Brother Watch in the UK, organise a number of different campaigns and pushbacks, contribute to consultations. Banks put out these consultations all the time. There was one recently in the UK, the Bank of England asking, what do you think about our CBDC plans? A group of different organizations got together in the UK, and we managed to get more than 50,000 responses, potentially about 500,000 pages of data into the Bank of England. And then on personal preparation, I think all you really need to think about is the top question there. How can you continue to transact freely if you're under constant surveillance and the government can freeze your money at any time? So we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, Bitcoin is nothing more than a monetary tool, but it is a monetary tool that allows you to continue transacting freely in a way that a CBDC does not. And I always come back to the idea that transactional freedom is really a fundamental and foundational freedom for a lot of others. There's no point in having freedom of speech if I shoot my mouth off and then I find that my bank account is frozen. Or there's no point in having freedom of association if I attend a political rally and then I find that the party in power has also managed to freeze my bank account and I can't feed my children or pay rent. So as we mentioned before, in terms of financial repression, if you can throttle someone's means of buying food, water, feeding their children, it's a very simple way and a very cost-effective way of controlling them. And the idea I return to again and again here is that CBDCs dramatically decreased the cost of government enforcement of what they want to do. Earlier in one of the panels, someone was talking about Executive Order 6102. One point that I would have added to what the discussion raised was that the cost of enforcement of 6102 was actually extraordinarily high. It would have involved the government paying people to go house to house to find people's gold, which is why, as Daniel said, you go for the low-hanging fruit. You go for the big custodians first. The cost of enforcement of confiscating Bitcoin from someone is extraordinarily high and unlikely to be paid by any government. Cost of enforcing CBDC confiscation, virtually nothing. So in terms of what we can do, I appreciate I'm running out of time, I'll be brief. learn as much as you can about censorship-resistant money, and prepare for a world in which people might be wanting to restrict your freedom to transact, because I'd like you all to maintain that. Bit of extra reading if anyone's interested. So the Cato Institute have done great work on CBDCs. They've got lots of papers on their website. Strongly recommend them. The Human Rights Foundation CBDC tracker is a fantastic piece of work. It's interactive. You can click on a country, you can spin the globe around and see what their plans are looking like, how far they've got down the line, and whether it's been a success or not. The good news is that none of them have been a success before, and long may that continue. And then our own website there, we have all of our papers in our research section there. And so to end on a bit of a whimsical note, I'm sure everyone has either heard of or watched The Lord of the Rings. We're in a very bizarre situation as regards our central bank money at the moment. You remember I said at the beginning, I'm quite a fan of cash. I like its good privacy protection. I like its strong censorship resistance. If you remember from the film, Gandalf wouldn't even touch the ring because he knew it was so dangerous and so powerful that it would corrupt a being even as virtuous as himself. We're now in an extraordinarily weird situation where central banks are saying, let's use the ring, but just for a little bit, and only for good purposes, and everything will be fine. Well, if you've seen The Lord of the Rings, you will know that absolutely would not have happened. So I'd encourage central banks to do the right thing, send these things into Mount Doom where they belong, and leave us free to use our Bitcoin as we see fit. And that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Next up is Alex Spetsky, and Alex has flown all the way over from Brazil to be with us. So that's a huge effort. We appreciate that. And I had the opportunity to hang out with both Freddie and Alex in Norway before we came here. We were there for the Human Rights Foundation, the Freedom Forum in Oslo. So yeah, Alex is going to come up and drop some news about what he's been doing for the last few years.
I'm going to see if I can offend absolutely everybody here and on the planet. So I prepared this talk on the way, so I'm going to need a couple of my notes here for assistance. But let's kick into it. So this is one of my favorite Nietzsche quotes of all time. If you crush a butterfly, you're a hero. If you crush a cockroach, you're a hero. If you crush a butterfly, you're a villain. Morality has aesthetic standards. And it's one of my all-time favorite quotes because the rationalist is going to argue with you. The Democrat will be offended. The moralist will tell you that it's unethical. The theologian will tell you it's wrong. The hippie will tell you it's cruel. The materialist will even argue with you on subjective grounds. In fact, all of your modern civilized conditioning will tell you it's unfair. But when push comes to shove and you see the cockroach, you're going to squash it and you're going to praise the person who does. While if you see someone do the same to a butterfly, you will be intuitively enraged by it. It'll piss you off. Even if you don't say anything, it'll make you angry. And this is really important because these visceral truths, these visceral reactions point to something fundamentally true about reality. And it's because they're instincts. Instincts, if you ask Nietzsche, something that we developed as lessons over time. Like instincts are lessons stored in our blood, our bodies, and our DNA, none of which can lie. Which is the reason why we're afraid of things like tigers and why we don't touch fire. Now, beauty is one of those things. Beauty is one of those deep, visceral truths. And beauty is also full of paradoxes. Beauty is simultaneously, in fact, it's the only thing that I believe is simultaneously objective and objective at the same time. Ian McGilchrist, who wrote The Master and His Emissary, fantastic book, which I haven't finished reading yet, but I've read parts of, says that beauty is symmetrically asymmetrical. Beauty is powerful, but it is also fragile. Beauty is dangerous, but it is also nurturing. Beauty is natural, but it is also man-made. Beauty is both everlasting and it's fleeting. Beauty is something that it's like truth. It cannot be decreed. Like you can't be told something is beautiful. You just have to recognize it, right? It's something you feel, not something you think. You can rationalize it after the fact, which we do, but beauty is recognizable, and that's very special. And the opposite of beauty, ugliness, has the exact same visceral characteristics. You know it when you see it because it has a repulsive effect, as you can see with these people. Now, if you compare them side by side, right? Whether it's a Calvin Klein ad, uh, you know which one is beautiful, which one is ugly. Whether it's architecture, you know which one is beautiful and ugly. Whether it's a family versus whatever the fuck the other thing is. Whether it's sculptures, right? You know what is beautiful, what's not. Like if you don't recognize the one on the bronze one, it's like the Martin Luther King, the modern statue of that. I don't know what the fuck it is. You see it in people as well, right? Dylan Mulvaney over here versus a beautiful woman, and Monica Bellucci versus whatever this thing is. And these two last ones point to something very interesting, and this is one of the many practical features of beauty, which is a signal for health and fertility. So life is the thing that wants to continue. Life wants to create. Life wants to produce. Life wants to ascend. And life cannot do that with something that is dead or barren, right? Now, this is also a good signal. If you want to know if someone is psychologically stable or not, you can ask them which of these things are beautiful, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. If you're psychologically functional, you'll know what's beautiful, what's not out of this. Which leads me to one of my favorite topics, which is called physiognomy. And this gets a lot of midwits really, really angry, which is why it's one of my favorite topics. But physiognomy represents beauty that manifests on the outside that comes from within. So, I've got a quote here, which is, beauty permeates everything, our thoughts, our emotions, and our physical bodies. So there's a great book by an author, probably forgotten. His name is Roald Dahl. He used to write children's books back when children's books were still based and not so woke. And this book here is called The Twits. So he has a quote in there which says, if a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on their face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier and uglier until you can hardly bear to look at it. And the corollary, and the opposite is also true with beautiful thoughts. Now, we have a great example here of Jacinda Ardern, who was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who decided to lock down 5 million people, forced them to get vaccinated and all the other bullshit. And the older she got, the more ugly thoughts she had and the more she turned into it. Now, of course, once again, the midwits will screech that physiognomy is a pseudoscience, that it's not real, that no, beauty is superficial. They will also screech that somehow lockdowns can stop a virus. But, as usual, physiognomy is real, and ugly people are wrong, basically. So, George Orwell, oops, where's my George Orwell slide? It's gone. George Orwell has a fantastic saying, which is, at 50, you get the face that you deserve, which is to do with how you behave, who you are on the inside. Beauty is truth. So I like to think of the divine mountain or the peak of the highest good. The two slopes that lead to it are beauty and truth, which also happen to be the two things that most corrupt institutions try and fake, right? They try and fake beauty, makeup, all that kind of crap, and truth, lies, etc. Economics is materialist. Like, I'm sure people here are probably familiar with Austrian economics and the subjective theory of value and all of that stuff, and that's all extremely important, but it lives in the materialist paradigm. It is not transcendent like beauty or truth. Beauty and truth both transcend the material. They transcend the world of economics and the world of the subjective. And this is why I tell people not to be fooled by dum-dums like this Tim Urban guy who did that Wait But Why podcast or blog or whatever it was. He is of these materialist weirdos like the Sam Harris of the world, etc., who think that beauty is entirely subjective. But that's completely false, because beauty is in the fundamental structure of the universe. It is, as I said earlier, it's beyond rational, but we can also rationalize it. It is beyond measurable, but we can also do our best to attempt to measure it. Beauty is in the fractals that literally make up life. The Fibonacci sequence, musical octaves, right? Geometry, sacred geometry, pi, which is the golden ratio, as you can see here. These things represent beauty. We've managed to kind of find our way there. And these patterns are not only beautiful, but as I said, they underpin the very structure of the melody of the universe. It's in the word. Universe means one song. These things are all interestingly related. Beauty is powerful, and power is actually beautiful. When you look at nature, a big part of why it is beautiful is because it is full of power. And power is a really dirty word in the Bitcoin space, unfortunately, and it's something we need to fix. You know, I've never understood how Bitcoiners could say in the same sentence, proof of work good, but power is evil or power is bad. And that doesn't make sense because these two things are both fundamentally entwined. Like in a physics sense, they're actually related. They're both, from an equation standpoint, fundamentally related. Power is work over time. But fundamentally speaking, like philosophically speaking, power is the capacity to channel energy. There's nothing evil about that. In fact, this is one of the big takeaway points that I want you guys to have is like power is not evil. It's not that power corrupts, but that the corrupt can attain power. Power is similar to technology in that it's agnostic, right? It's a thing that you give power to a sadist, he will try and trample on those below him and bring those above him down, right? Whereas a powerful person, a strong person, a responsible person, a virtuous person will seek to channel that power towards more beauty. And this is a really, 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 really important mental shift that people need to make is when we start to vilify things like power, we leave a vacuum for the parasites to take hold. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But this is an example of somebody who is channeling power for a better cause. Like this is a beautiful use of power. And it's an example of what we as Bitcoiners should be seeking to do at a broader scale. And we know this, like there was a Lord of the Rings reference in the previous talk, but for me, Tolkien touched on something really, really deep. Is the ugly were the orcs and the goblins. They represented the evil. The good were the elves and the humans who represented the beautiful. And this is another example of one of those visceral truths that we know deep down. So I'd like to put forth my definition, which I think is the true definition of evil, and it's not mine. It's shared by the Nietzsches of the world and all of these people. Is that the true definition of evil is that which wants to defile and destroy the beautiful. And you see this a lot in communist regimes. They want to tear everything down. They want to make everything ugly. They want to make everything gray, right? And when you think about all of these people are the ones who they don't want you to know that power is beautiful. They want you to think that power is evil so that you can abdicate your responsibility to channel it. They want you to leave a vacuum for them to fill. They want to make you believe bullshit like power is evil, beauty is ugly, beauty is superficial, all this sort of stuff. It's fundamentally wrong. What they are most afraid of is you being powerful and you creating beautiful stuff. This is what they're most afraid of because it reflects on them. It reflects on their ugliness. Remember before when we did the comparisons of beauty and ugly? If everything is ugly, you don't have a comparison against which to compare it. So they turned your own conscience against you. They made you believe that power and beauty were evil, and when in fact the truth is that weakness and ugliness are the evil thing. So make no mistake about it, this is the real fight that we're up against. I used to think that it was communism versus capitalism, but I was actually wrong. I even wrote a goddamn book about it. But the real fight is actually communism versus beauty. And that's the fundamental truth of the world, and that's something that we've forgotten that we need to remember. So what does all of this have to do with Bitcoin? Well, as our Chad friends say, everything. Bitcoin is, in my opinion, an opportunity to revive beauty. And that is because beauty is the ultimate in low time preference pursuits. Like there's nothing more low time preference than beauty. Whether that is raising a family, building beautiful kids, putting the energy that it takes to do that, whether it is building a beautiful body, an aesthetic body, whether it is building a product or a service or a company or a sculpture or a cathedral that takes 300 years to build. These things are beautiful. Whether it's the creation of these mountains that took tens of thousands of years or the very earth that we're living on. Beauty fundamentally takes time, whereas ugliness, whether it's dropping a bomb on someone or chopping your genitals off, that only takes a second, right? And if we can, and this is the piece about Bitcoin, if we can build a monetary system that rewards low time preference, not by political decree, it's not because I told you to save, but because the very nature of the money is such that people save it, people respect it, people like their time and their energy, can respect it. You get three things. You get the localization of economic consequence. We were talking earlier with Dan on the panel about Bitcoin as responsibility money. It's not just about freedom, but freedom that comes with a responsibility. So if you send your Bitcoin to the wrong address, there's no support line that you can call and say, hey, Satoshi, can you give me my money back? So it's extremely responsible money, but that's why it's also freeing. So you get the localization of economic consequence. You reward good behavior, you punish bad. It increases adaptability. So on a Bitcoin standard, the economic signal increases. So you get better signal and better feedback loops, which increases the adaptability of the system, the economy being a system. And then it fits the territories, fits the map to the territory better, which means you have a more natural and organic system. And what do we do as human beings when we have more time and more space? Well, we have the time and the patience to build beautiful things, which is an example here, right? So Bitcoin, in my unpopular opinion, is not just about banking the unbanked or store a value or get rich and get my Lambo and all that sort of stuff. It is about all of that stuff, but in my opinion, it's about so much more. Bitcoin is a framework for excellence and a framework for beauty that the ugly and the deceitful will have a much harder time breaking down. So that's why today I want to add my definition to the whole Bitcoin of all of these things. It's a framework for excellence and beauty. Because I agree with Dostoevsky, with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, with Nietzsche, with Orwell, with Chesterton, with Plato, with Aristotle, and all of the great thinkers of all time. Beauty is the thing that will save the world. I was asked the question earlier today about, okay, well, we've got Bitcoin, but does that really help? It's like, yes, that's a good piece, but there's so much more that we need to develop. We need to inculcate these virtues. That's why I spent the last 2 years, 7 drafts, 125,000 words, like writing a book about it, about beauty in particular, but also power, about virtues, about culture, about civilization. Because it's up to us to create something more beautiful. Beauty is not a given. Just because we got Bitcoin today doesn't mean we magically become more beautiful tomorrow. It requires work. It requires that we become better, because who we are is defined by what we do. And in that book, I actually explore the 10 virtues that overlap across the greatest cultures throughout human history that preceded the greatest civilizations that came thereafter, whether it was the Japanese, whether it was the medieval and the feudal West, the Faustian West, whether it was the Romans, the ancient Greeks, the Macedonians, all of that, the Thracians, the Illyrians, all of that, these cultures established the greatest civilizations that came after. And the way I like to explain it to people is, if the fiat standard today requires a set of virtues, a set of non-virtues, right? Things like cheating, lying, stealing, working for a bureaucratic apparatus, a Bitcoin standard is going to require a new framework in order for you to get ahead. And this, in my opinion, is the kind of playbook, because virtues transcend even beliefs. People of different religions who might have completely different beliefs still recognize things like things like courage, and compassion, and honor, and respect, and loyalty. These things are virtues that transcend belief. So, if this got you thinking a little bit, if this triggered you, if you're interested in these kind of topics, I don't have time obviously to go through it here, but I go through it in the book. Like, I explore each virtue etymologically, psychologically, philosophically, historically, and I go into deep rabbit holes like virtue powers, all that sort of stuff. And if you feel like I feel, which is we've been lied to about a lot of these topics, then I'd like to invite you to come and explore this book as I launch it, which is basically today. Or it's going to be at Prague next week, but I'm going to you guys get a little bit of a taster. Because I truly believe that, like, we are on the cusp of a new era. Like, we are, this is the whole cyclical thing about, weak men, strong men, good times, bad times, etc. And we are definitely right in the stage of, like, weak men, hard times, and there's going to be an opportunity to spin that around. And it's our duty to basically say no to the people who think you will own nothing and be happy, right? So, like, we need to say no and fuck you basically to that. So Bitcoin, in my opinion, is the first step to something more beautiful. So to close out, I would like to leave you with a little trailer for the book. In fact, just to give you an idea, this talk came from one of the chapters of the book. I was thinking, what the hell am I going to discuss? And I think beauty is such a powerful and profound topic. So if you guys, well, I was gonna say take a photo of those QR codes, but it's all good. I'm gonna put this trailer on, and then if you guys are interested in some more information, you can go to bushidoofbitcoin.com, and you'll get all the information there. But sit back, relax, and enjoy a 2-minute trailer of the book. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage, Filip Karađorđević.
Cheers. Good luck. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Well, today I'm not going to be talking about Jan 3. Today I'm going to be actually shitting on politicians. So that's why it's high time for low time preference. This is a presentation I decided to come up with because it's something that when I understood what Bitcoin was, and one of the aspects of Bitcoin that really stood out to me was its low time preference philosophy. Sorry, I don't know how this thing works. Yeah, there we go. So I've got some notes over here. Sorry, I'll try to not read too much, but here this is the agenda for my presentation, and basically we'll discuss these elements and how they interact and influence each other, and why and understanding why time preference is crucial. We'll delve into economic theories, government structures, and the importance of family and legacy. And also, I'll reference various works from notable authors and thinkers to provide a comprehensive view of these topics. These references include people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, Safety and Amuse, who you all know, G.K. Chesterton, Alex de Tocqueville, and Mencken and Davila. So, what is time preference? Savings and investments in capital goods are what makes civilization possible. Time preference refers to the degree to which individuals value present goods over future goods. This concept is essential in understanding economic behaviors and investment decisions. Delayed gratification is a crucial aspect of capital formation and roundabout production. In the Bitcoin Standard, Safety and Amuse explains how investing in education or infrastructure today can lead to greater future benefits. He writes, savings and investments in capital goods are what makes civilization possible.
By understanding and promoting low time preference, we can create a more stable and more prosperous society. This involves implementing policies that protect property rights, encourage savings, and support long-term investments. High versus low time preference. High time preference is characterized by a preference for immediate consumption, often caused by insecurity, lack of property rights, and poor economic policies. Individuals with high time preferences are more likely to consume rather than save and invest. This behavior will lead to economic instability and stagnation. Hopper, Hans Hermann Hopper that is, argues that democracy by its very nature tends to promote higher time preference due to the short-term focus of elected officials who prioritize immediate rewards to secure re-election, often at the expense of long-term stability and growth. On the other hand, low time preference involves a preference for future consumption and is associated with strong property rights, knowledge, security, and stable governance. Hopper argues that the protection of private property rights is essential for fostering an environment where low time preference can thrive. We're going to talk about fiat now. Everyone knows fiat. So, fiat, well, I don't think you guys need much explanation about fiat. Government-based money, not backed by anything physical commodity. It's unlimited supply growth. It's as its supply increases, the value of each unit decreases, leading to inflation. This encourages people to adopt a high time preference, focusing on immediate consumption rather than saving for the future. Safety in the Bitcoin standard explains that this inflationary environment undermines long-term planning and investment. This creates an economic environment where immediate consumption is prioritized over saving and investment, as the future value of money is uncertain. He states, inflation is a policy that reduces the value of money held by the public, transferring wealth to the issuer of new money, which is referencing the Cantillon effect, which is an economic phenomenon which increases wealth inequality by benefiting those closer to the money printer. And those further down the food chain, like us and me as well, apparently, we have to live the sad reality of that inflation gets worse as we get further away from the money printer, because we get worse rates, worse borrowing rates, and it's at the end of the day, it adds to the inequality of society. Now we have Bitcoin. Don't have to explain much about Bitcoin over here, but it's a stark contrast to the fiat system, to what fiat is. Its supply is capped at 21 million, ensuring a predictable and deflationary monetary policy. The characteristics of Bitcoin promotes low time preference amongst its users. By holding Bitcoin, individuals can preserve their wealth over time, as its value is expected to increase due to the limited supply and increasing demand. Safe highlights that Bitcoin's immutable monetary policy makes it the best way to save value across time. This predictability encourages long-term planning and investment, fostering an environment where individuals can focus on future benefits rather than immediate gratification. Family and legacy. So this is one thing I really wanted to talk about, is family, and I think that family is really important when it comes to Bitcoin. And I guess after Alex Spetzi's presentation about beauty, we have good synergies between both our presentations. Family is beautiful, and I think Bitcoin helps family. And family, in its essence, is adopting a low time preference. If you want to raise your family, you have to if you have to be a good father and mother and raise a good family, you really have to lower your time preference. So talk about family and legacy here. Intergenerational wealth involves building and passing on wealth and values to the next generation. This concept is fundamental in ensuring that the achievements and benefits of one generation are preserved and extended by the next. Investing in family businesses, education, and property ensures that the legacy continues and that each generation builds upon the foundation laid by the previous ones. Bitcoin plays a significant role in aiding the preservation of transfer of intergenerational wealth by providing a secure and stable store of value. Bitcoin ensures that wealth accumulated by one generation can be safely passed on to the next. Unlike fiat currencies, which are subject to inflation and devaluation, Bitcoin's fixed supply and deflationary nature protects us against these risks, making an ideal tool for long-term wealth preservation and transfer. Thanks to Bitcoin being the best savings technology ever created, investing in family businesses, education, and property is made easier and more secure, ensuring that these investments can yield benefits for generations to come. C.S. Lewis, in his address, Learning in Wartime, reminds us that amidst chaos, the pursuit of beauty and truth remains vital. He states, "The war creates no absolutely new situation. It simply aggravates the permanent human situation. This underscores the importance of maintaining cultural and intellectual pursuits even in challenging times." Lewis delivered this in Oxford University in 1931 at the start of the Second World War. He was addressing this in front of students, trying to tackle whether the students should pursue education and culture while they were under attack or during war. Ultimately, he concluded that learning and cultural activities offered to God serve as the pathways to divine reality and beauty, urging students to continue their studies with diligence and faith despite the war. Dostoevsky, one of Russia's most influential writers, frequently explored the themes of art, legacy, and intrinsic connection to reality. One of his quotes was, "Art is always true to the reality in the highest degree. It cannot be unfaithful to contemporary reality," which reflects his conviction that art must serve as a mirror to the time, portraying the authentic experiences, values, and conditions of society. This is where things like the urinal on the display and the banana seller taped to the wall really come to mind right now. Governance and time preference. The civilization process. Lowering time preference is a hallmark of civilized society. In Democracy, the God of Hell by Hopper argues that the establishment and protection of private property rights are fundamental to the development of a prosperous and civilized society. He writes, "The fundamental requirement of civilization is the establishment of private property and the rule of law. This ensures that individuals can plan for the long term without fear of arbitrary confiscation and regulatory changes." Hopper explains that good governance upholds property rights, which in turn encourage investments and economic stability. When the individuals feel secure in their ownership of property and assets, they are more likely to invest in the long-term projects, such as infrastructure, education, and technological advancements. In contrast, government systems that prioritize protection of, Prince Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein also advocates for the state serving the people, ensuring that security, freedom, and property. He states that the state should serve the people and not the other way around. The state exists to ensure the security, freedom, and property of its citizens. By understanding the relationship between governance, property rights, and time preference, we can appreciate the importance of creating and maintaining institutions that support strong property rights, long-term planning, and investments. Now, democracy versus monarchy. Coming from a prince, it's kind of rich me advocating for monarchy, but I have to do it because it does make sense as a Bitcoiner. So, democracy often leads to higher time preference due to short-term election cycles and populist policies. I mean, this is obvious. This is because elected officials are motivated by the need to secure votes for the next election, leading them to prioritize immediate rewards over long-term stability and growth. Frequent policy changes and a focus on short-term gains can undermine economic stability and discourage long-term investments. Hopper, in Democracy, the God That Fell, criticizes democracy for its tendency to elevate short-term interest over long-term planning. He writes, "Democratic rulers are by nature high time preference individuals. They prefer current consumption over future investment because their time horizon is limited by the duration of their term in office." H.L. Mencken, a prominent American journalist, essayist, and cultural critic, was known for his sharp wit and incisive commentary on society, including democracy. His quote, "Democracy is the theory that the common people know what they want and deserve it to get it good and hard," encapsulates the potential pitfalls of populism and short-term thinking in democratic systems. Alex de Tocqueville was a French political thinker and historian best known for his work Democracy in America, which is a profound analysis of the American democratic system and its implications for society. He says in Democracy in America, he explores the tensions between equality and freedom, noting that the push for equality can sometimes come at the expense of the individual freedom and long-term social stability. He writes, Americans are so enamored by equality that they would rather be equal in slavery than unequal in freedom. Monarchy. Conversely, monarchy can foster low time preference through long-term planning and stability. Monarchical systems are often characterized by generational investment and long-term national strategies. This is because monarchs who rule for life often pass down their power to descendants, have a vested interest in the long-term health and stability of their realm. So yes, sorry, when I'm talking about monarchy, I'm talking about it in the purest sense, absolute monarchy. I'm not really talking about constitutional, just to get it straight. Hopper in Democracy, the God That Fell, argues that monarchies, due to their hereditary nature, align the ruler's interests with the long-term prosperity of the domain. Hopper writes, monarchs, unlike democratic politicians, own their country and thus have a personal interest in maintaining and increasing its value. This leads to policies that favor long-term growth and stability. Private property and civilization. Private property is like really essential for maintaining low time preference and economic stability. The protection and respect for private property rights encourage savings, investment, and long-term planning. Again, Hopper, I like to reference him a lot, emphasizes the importance of private property as the foundation of a prosperous and civilized society. He writes, only private property rights ensure that the scarce resources are used in the most efficient and value-productive manner, and that conflicts over the use of resources are minimized. Without the protection of private property, society would be in a state of constant conflict and economic stagnation. When private property rights are undermined, it raises time preferences and reverses progress. Individuals become more focused on immediate consumption rather than long-term planning, leading to economic instability and societal decline. Nicolas Gomez Davila, a Colombian philosopher and writer, explores the profound impact of cultural values and the survival of civilizations. He poignantly states that violence is not necessary to destroy a civilization. Each civilization dies from the indifference towards the unique values which created it. This statement highlights how neglect and disregard for foundational cultural values can lead to the decline and collapse of society. Something very evident in our world today, in many parts of our world. So this is something I wanted to raise, is that how Bitcoin, monarchy, and strong property rights actually lead to less crime and conflict. Again, Hopper in Democracy, the God That Fails, writes, strong property rights are what are foundational to creating a predictable and peaceful society. When the individual feels secure in ownership of property and assets, they are less likely to engage in conflicts. Monarchical governments also contribute to societal stability by reducing the frequency of conflicts. Monarchies, this is pre-World War I, they were more invested in the long term and more invested in having more stable societies. So their conflicts were much more strategic and concentrated, rather than post-World War I, after the creation of fiat, where we see this constant state of perpetual warfare and fiat wars. From Republican democratic ideas of short-term gains and all these populist policies. Bitcoin and the principles of sound money discourage crime and foster economic stability. Bitcoin's immutable monetary policy and the transparency of its time chain make it difficult to use for illicit activities. Ultimately, the combination of strong property rights and monarchical governments and a Bitcoin standard creates an environment where crime and conflict are less prevalent. By securing property rights and fostering economic stability, we can build a more peaceful and prosperous society. The role of family in society. The family serves as a foundation for maintaining low time preference and cultural continuity. It is within the family unit that individuals learn the values and behaviors that shape their preferences and actions throughout their lives. Through education, moral values, financial literacy, families play a crucial role in shaping future generations. G.K. Chesterton, an influential English writer, philosopher, and critic, in his work What's Wrong with the World, argues for the importance of traditional family roles. He states, the world outside the home was one of mass narrowness, a maze of cramped paths, a madhouse of monomaniacs. Chesterton's observation highlights the stability and the broad scope of activities within a family, contrasting it with the narrowness and confusion often found outside. Traditional family roles provide us with a sense of purpose and structure, essential for developing low time preferences and long-term planning. Of course, I had to have a whole slide on Hans Hopper, but I thought this quote was beautiful because it states that the saver investor, that could be the Bitcoiner, initiates a process of civilization in generating a tendency to fall in generating a tendency towards a fall in the rate of time preference. He and everyone directly or indirectly connected to him through a network of exchanges matures from childhood to adulthood, from barbarism to civilization. I think that's a beautiful quote about low time preference, adopting it, and it hits me. I mean, it's quite emotional when I read that because as I become more aware of what Bitcoin means to me and my family, and the network of people I meet here in conferences and around the world, that's how we all have similar views. We may not agree on everything, but we align on the idea of family values and of low time preferences, and that network of well, I guess that network gets us to a more civilized society, I guess. I mean, so I didn't really say that very well, but the future with Bitcoin and monarchy, a path to stability and prosperity. As I come to the end of the presentation, I want to summarize the key points that we've covered. That is Bitcoin, private property, monarchy, and family. And we explore how Bitcoin is a crucial element that enables the progress of families and civilization. Firstly, understanding time preference is essential for recognizing how individuals and societies make decisions regarding consumption and investment. Lowering time preference leads to increased savings, investment, and long-term planning. Bitcoin, as a decentralized deflationary currency, encourages low time preference by providing a stable store of value. Then I talked about monarchical systems and their emphasis on generational continuity and long-term strategies, which provide a stable environment conducive to economic and cultural prosperity. That monarchies also are strong believers of having strong property rights, which is really important for lowering our time preference. And finally, the family, as the foundation of society, plays a crucial role in maintaining low time preference and cultural continuity. Through education, moral values, traditions, and financial literacy, families shape future generations, ensuring that the values and practices that support low time preferences are passed down. And now, thanks to Bitcoin, I believe, is a missing piece in progressing civilization further by protecting individuals and families. By providing a reliable store of value that is not subject to the whims of governmental policies and inflation, Bitcoin allows families to save and plan for the future with confidence. With Bitcoin, sound like Trump over there. With Bitcoin, families can build intergenerational wealth, ensuring that each generation can build upon the success of the previous one. And here's just as a difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin protocol is the crucial factor that harmonizes all its underlying technologies, making Bitcoin scalable and robust. Bitcoin itself acts as the missing key for advancing human civilization. The difficulty adjustment ensures Bitcoin's stability and resilience by adjusting the computational effort needed to mine new blocks, maintaining a consistent rate of block creation despite fluctuations in network activity. Similarly, Bitcoin provides the economic stability needed for families and societies to flourish, enabling long-term investments and the preservation of wealth across generations. By integrating Bitcoin into our lives, we create an economic environment that supports true sustainable growth and societal progress, much like how the difficulty adjustment integrates and secures the various components of Bitcoin's technology. As Nietzsche's thoughts on historical awareness and future planning reminds us, learning from the past and making informed decisions are crucial for building a better future. By embracing a Bitcoin standard, we can foster a society that values long-term prosperity over short-term gains, ensuring a stable and prosperous future for all. In essence, by prioritizing low time preference and embracing Bitcoin, we create a stable and prosperous society that benefits both present and future generations. It is through careful planning, respect for private property, and the nurturing of cultural and moral values within the families that we can achieve this goal. Thank you very much. Sorry, just some of the references, the key ones on top, obviously I had to put hands on top, safe goes second. Prince Hans Adam, great book if you haven't read that. And then Josh Dolani, that's his Twitter handle. Check him out. His book, Hit Reverse, New Ideas from Old Books, gave me a lot of gold, or I should say Bitcoin, for the other references I used in my essay that I just read out to you. So thank you very much, and looking forward to speaking to a lot of you guys later. Thanks. Bye.
Wait there, Philip. Wait there.
Yeah,
Wait there. I want to ask you a question, and I know a lot of people come in from the other room there towards the end. So, Jan 3, I remember a little personal story here. I remember when your video went viral. Who saw his video go viral on Twitter when he was on the chat show in Serbia? Did anyone see that? My wife and my daughter, because I forced them to sit down at the kitchen table and say, look what he's saying. He says all the same things I say, and he's a prince and shit. Like, this is amazing. Like, all of a sudden, Bitcoin had a royal kind of stamp of approval. But I remember watching it. I've watched the video back many times, and we talked a bit about this on the podcast that we did. He asked you, because your previous role was a financial advisory role, and he asked you for investment advice, the show host, in crypto.
In crypto, no, he asked, is it now a good time to talk about crypto?
Yes.
And that's what got me riled up. And I said, no, it's not about crypto, it's all about Bitcoin.
But it was the pause.
Yeah.
It was the pause that was the gold. If you go back and watch it, he's kind of like gasps, and his wife's sitting next to him on the couch, and I know what's going through her head. Don't you fucking dare talk about it. Don't do this. Not now on national television. And he did. And he went for 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Talking about Bitcoin, educating the host and obviously the live TV Serbian audience.
He did say, he stopped me at, I believe we should take the state away from the money away from the state. He's like, oh, should we stop you there? I was like, no, it's good. And I still continued, and he was like, is this free investment advice? Of course it's free.
And then Philip went on to come to Miami, the conference in 2022.
I know, but let's rewind. After that went viral, you're one of the first people that reached out to me. And thanks to Daniel Prince, he took me under his wing. And as I came out the closet, he was one of the first guys to introduce me to other guys and about Bitcoin. And you introduced me to Samson, who I then had a phone call with before being invited together. We were invited to go to Miami conference, and we flew out in Miami. I met with Samson, and he offered me the role at Jan 3, which I didn't think about it for a second. I just accepted it because I'd been working in fiat traditional finance for 15 years, 10 years at my old company. And having become a maxi and just being uncomfortable working in a fiat mining job, I really wanted to get out. So Samson's voice was like, hey, do you want to work for me? I'm recruiting you. Was like, yes.
So just by taking that first step, putting your first foot forward, trying to add value to the space in any which way you can, and I understand many of you aren't going to get invited onto a talk show and whatever else, but there are certain things that you can do. You can start a Bitcoin event. You can start a Bitcoin meetup. You can run a conference like Plowman has done here and invite people from all over the world, and you'll be shocked at the amount of support that you get. But a follow-up question, Jan 3, can you give us a little look behind the curtain? Tomorrow. That's what the talk is about tomorrow.
Yeah, just a little look about. Yeah. No. How much do you want?
I'm sure everybody wants to know, like, what are the conversations taking place at the?
There's a few conversations, but it's it's hard to say. Look, it's difficult to create conversations with politicians around the world. When I have a diplomatic passport, and if I create a diplomatic line of communication to a different country and say, "Hey, I want to talk to you about Bitcoin," it's a no, of course. So we actually depend on people like yourselves. We actually depend on locals, on local Bitcoiners on the ground, like all over the world, that actually come to us and say, "Hey, look, you're Gen3. We know you're the nation-state adoption company. We've identified so-and-so politician, and they're interested about Bitcoin." Oh, great! So we create a Telegram group. We have a Zoom call, and that may lead to a meeting. And obviously, as you probably know, that not many of these conversations actually lead to anything. But the fact is, it does create conversations. It does create some sort of social proofing in some respect. We go there. We use that as a marketing opportunity as well. Take photos of a president, of a politician with some Bitcoiners. Just add some. Yeah, we understand that Bitcoin is a bottom-up approach. It's a grassroots effort. You can't stop that. That's the beauty about Bitcoin. But we feel that maybe there has to be a little bit of hand from top down, and that's why governments can, well, they're never going to come handy, but you can use governments, leverage them to make Bitcoin work for you. And if you introduce them to how Bitcoin can help them and how they can help their subjects, then that's beneficial. Say, for example, one of the areas that we like to work on is mining ventures, like a joint venture in mining. If we create a joint venture with a public authority, a government organization that's actually mining Bitcoin, then they might be more kinder to Bitcoin in the future. They might actually start to understand it better and then to regulate it better, meaning that they will actually don't understand that Bitcoin doesn't need much regulation, but obviously regulate the shit out of shitcoins because they're all securities. So it's all about education, really. That's what we're focusing on at a global level. And there are some interesting conversations happening around the world. I can't divulge on much, but we're continuing. And I think now with thanks to the ETFs and the institutional adoption that we've seen happening this year, from the beginning of this year when it happened, that there's more interest. And the bull market has only just started getting going. And I mean, I don't think there's going to be any countries adopting Bitcoin like El Salvador did. We think that that's an outlier. We won't get another Bukele, but you never know what Bill Run can do to some countries. But we think maybe in the next 10 years, after 2 democratic election cycles, woohoo, that we will get maybe more people putting it on the platforms. This is what we were saying a few months ago. Then we saw that President Trump, he could be President Trump again, actually talking about it and he was very pro US dollar and anti-crypto, but then he's like, oh no, I'm going to protect your Bitcoins, plural, against some Elizabeth Warren and her goons. And he also said self-custody, which is huge for an ex-president and could be the next sitting president to say self-custody. That is massive. So I think Bitcoin doesn't give a shit about the governments really, but I think we gotta play them and gotta understand how they work to make Bitcoin work, and we have to be intelligent and strategic. So that's what we're doing, Jan 3.
All right, excellent, and to be discussed at length again tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Cheers, Dan.
Woo! Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, thank you so much for literally doing half the work today. It was so easy to me. Actually, someone outside asked me like, it was Anya, wasn't it? Yeah. She said like, you look quite relaxed, and I was like, yeah, because I'm used to doing this all by myself. And Daniel here was helping the whole day and literally covering half of the work. So I didn't even like worry at all. I was like, I know he can handle it. I know he's gonna handle it. And I know if by any chance he needs my assistance, he's gonna come and ask for it. And you didn't the whole day. So great job. I know that on this stage it was a bit empty for the past an hour and a half. We had an amazing discussion on the other side on the topic of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin standard, and the regulations that are coming, that might come, and so on. nation state adoption, but on the meaning of what we expect. So tomorrow we are gonna get actually from the kitchen some updates and like what's in progress and what we can help for. So I'm gonna switch to Bulgarian again. Thank you so much, and let's applaud Daniel for his work today.